Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back to a hot summer in 1518, to a city in what is now France, but back then was part of the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to explore a truly bizarre event that unfolded in Strasbourg, something historians still scratch their heads about. Imagine a quiet street, the kind of street where people knew their neighbors, maybe shared a loaf of bread, or complained about the weather. Now imagine one person, then another, then dozens, then hundreds, all doing the same inexplicable thing, dancing. Not for fun, not for a festival, but compulsively, relentlessly, until they couldn't stand anymore. It sounds like something out of a fever dream, right? Well, buckle up, because you're about to dive into the story of the town that danced itself towards oblivion. This is definitely one of those historical rabbit holes that makes you wonder what on earth was going on. And frankly, you probably won't survive listening to the whole thing without drifting off, which you know is kind of the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening live or just want to share, let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now in the comments. Knowing these stories are reaching sleepy ears all over the world is pretty cool. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late July in 1518. You find yourself walking along a cobbled street in Strasbourg. The air is thick and warm, the kind of heat that makes even the slightest movement feel like effort. This isn't the bustling metropolis you might think of today. It's a free imperial city, important shore, strategically located near the Rhine, a center of trade and printing, but life is lived at a different pace. Slower perhaps, but certainly not without its hardships and stresses, which we'll get into later. For now, just picture the scene: half-timbered houses leaning slightly against each other, the smell of wood smoke, and maybe, well, let's just say medieval street smells weren't exactly Chanel No. 5. Probably best not to linger on that sensory detail too much if you're trying to relax. You're ambling along, maybe running an errand, or just taking the evening air when you notice her. She's standing in the street right there on the paving stones. Frauen Trophäa, or Frau Trophäa, as she's often recorded. A woman like any other in the street, perhaps her age is unremarkable. Her clothing typical for a wife of a craftsman or merchant of moderate means. Nothing about her appearance would make you stop and stare normally. But right now you are stopping and staring. She's swaying. Not a gentle, thoughtful sway, but something different. Her feet are beginning to move, a shuffling, rhythmic motion on the stones. At first you might think she's just adjusting her balance, or maybe trying to dislodge a stubborn pebble from her shoe. But the movement doesn't stop. It becomes more pronounced. She's definitely dancing, right there in the middle of the street. No music you can hear, no partner, no apparent reason. You watch her for a moment. It's peculiar. Is she drunk? It's possible, though, her movements seem controlled despite their strangeness. Not the stumble and sway of intoxication, but a focused, repetitive action. Is she ill? Perhaps some kind of seizure. But she's upright, her eyes might be open, maybe even staring straight ahead with an unnerving intensity. You wouldn't typically see someone having a fit, just dancing. Other people start to notice too. Heads poke out of windows. Neighbors emerge from doorways. A small crowd begins to gather, murmuring. They exchange confused glances. What is she doing? Is this some kind of performance? But it doesn't look like any dance they know. There's no joy in it, no grace, just movement, relentless movement. And she keeps going. The minutes tick by. The shuffling turns into more definite steps, a kind of jigging, maybe a turning motion. Her arms might begin to flail slightly, or perhaps hang limp by her sides, depending on the accounts you choose to believe. One quirky tidbit from some retellings suggests her movements were incredibly energetic, almost violent right from the start, while others paint a picture of a more monotonous, trance-like state. It's hard to know exactly what it looked like minute by minute from half a millennium away. But the key point is she didn't stop. An hour passes. She is still dancing. Her breath must be coming faster now. Her face perhaps pale or flushed, showing the strain. 2 hours, 3 hours. The novelty for the onlookers starts to wear off and is replaced by something else. Concern, annoyance, fear. Imagine trying to explain this to someone who wasn't there. Yeah, this woman just started dancing and she hasn't stopped for hours. You'd sound crazy, like you'd had too much questionable medieval ale yourself. Historians still argue whether her initial movements were truly involuntary, a medical or psychological event, or if there was some initial, perhaps delusional intent that quickly spiraled out of control. Did she choose to start, perhaps believing she was compelled by a higher power, or a curse only for the physical act to take over? Or was it a sudden onset of an uncontrollable physical impulse? We just don't have definitive proof of that very first spark inside her mind or body. By the end of the day, Mrs. Trofea is still dancing. As dusk settles over Strasbourg, casting long shadows down the narrow streets, she continues her strange, solitary performance. She must be utterly exhausted, her muscles aching, her lungs burning. How has she not collapsed? It defies belief. You watching this would be tired just from standing there. This puts your attempt at a 5K run last week to shame. This is ultra-marathon levels of physical exertion, but without the cool running gear or the energy gels. Just dancing for hours on cobblestones, probably in restrictive clothing and uncomfortable shoes. Seriously, medieval footwear did not look built for this kind of non-stop activity. Imagine the blisters. The crowd might have dispersed and reformed multiple times. People would have gone about their business, eaten dinner, tucked their kids into surprisingly uncomfortable-looking beds, and then maybe come back out to see if she was still going. And she was. Through the night, the account suggests she continued. A lone figure illuminated perhaps by the occasional lantern or the weak light of a moon moving ceaselessly in the street. You might try to talk to her, to ask her what's wrong. Why is she doing this, but she might not respond? Her focus, if she has any external focus at all, seems elsewhere, lost in the rhythm of her own feet. Maybe she's mumbling, maybe she's silent. The fear starts to creep in now. This isn't just eccentric behavior. This is something deeply unsettling. It's not a party. It's not religious ecstasy you recognize. It's just dancing and dancing and dancing without pause, without rest. The mainstream historical fact here is simply that this event began with one woman, Frau Trofea, on or around July 14th, 1518, starting to dance in the street and continuing for a prolonged period. This wasn't a group event that started spontaneously with many people. It had a documented singular origin point with this one individual. It's the pebble that starts the avalanche. And the quirky tidbit, think about the typical understanding of madness or strange behavior in the 16th century. It wasn't clinical psychology as we know it. Strange afflictions were often attributed to spiritual causes, divine punishment, demonic possession curses, or imbalances in the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Remember those from your brief encounter with medieval medicine. There wasn't a readily available category for person compulsively dancing for days, so the initial reactions before it escalated would likely be rooted in these limited understandings. People weren't thinking stress-induced psychogenic disorder. They were probably thinking witchcraft, sin, or really, really bad humors, which in retrospect is kind of a hilarious underestimation of the problem, like trying to fix a server crash by unplugging your router. By the end of this first day, Mrs. Trofea is no longer just a curious sight. She's becoming a local phenomenon, a deeply strange, worrying one. People are talking. Whispers are spreading. What is happening to her? And more importantly, could it happen to someone else? You go to bed that night assuming she must have stopped by now. No one can dance for this long, right? You drift off to sleep, the image of her tireless form, perhaps still lingering in your mind. But you are wrong. When the sun rises over Strasbourg the next morning, she is, according to the historical account, still dancing. And she wouldn't be alone for much longer. You wake up the next morning in Strasbourg. The sun is filtering through your window. The sounds of the city are starting to stir. Carts on cobblestones, distant calls. One thought immediately comes to mind: is she still out there? Fraunhofer, the woman who wouldn't stop dancing. You throw on some clothes, maybe grab a quick bite, a piece of bread, some cheese, standard medieval breakfast fare. Probably not as exciting as your oat milk latte, sorry to tell you. And head back towards the street where you saw her yesterday. As you approach, you hear a different kind of sound mixed in with the usual city noise. A rhythmic shuffling, perhaps some gasping breaths. And then you see it. She's still there. Unbelievably, Frau Trofea is still moving her tireless, strange dance, continuing as if the past day and night hadn't even happened. She looks worse, obviously. Sweat-soaked clothes, hair, disheveled face, a mask of exhaustion. But the feet are still moving. It's haunting. But now, she's not alone. Overnight, or perhaps just this morning, others have joined her. Scattered around her, maintaining their own strange, solitary dances, are several more figures. A man, perhaps, swaying awkwardly. Another woman, maybe her arms held stiffly as she pivots. How many 3-4? It's not a huge crowd yet, not an overwhelming tide, but it's more than one. It's a pattern. It's spreading. You stand there watching, utterly perplexed. What could possibly cause this? Is it something in the air? Something in the water? A curse, a shared delusion. The initial shock of seeing Frau Trofea alone has morphed into something more deeply unsettling now that others are involved. This isn't an individual eccentricity anymore. It's starting to look like an outbreak. The people joining don't seem to know each other necessarily, or at least they're not dancing with each other in any coordinated way. Each person is lost in their own world of compulsive movement, seemingly oblivious to everything else around them, maybe even to the other dancers. It's a collection of individuals united only by this bizarre, exhausting activity. You might try calling out to one of them, asking if they're okay what's happening. You might get no response, or perhaps a vacant stare, or maybe just a grunt of effort as they force their aching bodies through another turn. News of this spreads like wildfire through the narrow streets of Strasbourg. Have you heard old Peter down by the bridge? He started dancing. Marguerite from the market, she's out there too. The initial curiosity turns to genuine alarm. People gather not just to watch, but to whisper amongst themselves, fear etched on their faces. Mothers pull their children closer. Doors that might have been left ajar are now firmly closed and bolted. The city authorities hear about it, of course. The magistrates, the members of the city council, the wise men, and they were almost exclusively men. Back then, sorry ladies, different times who governed Strasbourg. They're informed of this increasingly strange situation. Their initial reaction is probably one of disbelief. Dancing in the street for days. Nonsense. They must be drunkards, vagrants causing a disturbance. But as the reports multiply and the number of dancers grows, perhaps reaching a dozen or more within a few days, they can no longer dismiss it. These officials tasked with maintaining order and prosperity in a busy, important city are faced with something entirely outside their experience. They have laws about trade, about public hygiene, or lack thereof, about crime, about religious practice. But there's no ordinance on the books about people dancing themselves into collapse. They are frankly clueless. Their knowledge of such matters would be based on superstition, religious interpretation, or perhaps rudimentary Galenic medicine. What do? They need to do something. This is a public spectacle, a potential disruption, and frankly, it's just plain weird. Quirky tidbit alert. One of the early suggestions born out of that limited medical understanding involving humors was that the dancers needed more dancing. Seriously. The idea was rooted in the belief that the condition was caused by hot blood needing to be expelled through movement. So the city council, in a move that sounds utterly bonkers to our modern ears, actually decided to facilitate the dancing. They opened up public spaces like the Fish Market Square naturally for the dancers. They even went so far as to hire musicians, drummers, and pipers to provide music and strong men, to build stages or barriers, perhaps thinking that structured, continuous movement to music would be therapeutic. Imagine that the city council effectively enabling the very behavior they were trying to stop based on a completely flawed understanding. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, but with flailing limbs instead of flames. Historians still argue whether this decision was a moment of profound, albeit misguided civic responsibility, trying to help the afflicted, or a desperate, almost farcical attempt to control the uncontrollable by giving it a designated space, hoping it would just dance itself out. It's hard to give them too much credit when you consider the outcome. The mainstream historical fact here is that the dancing affliction very quickly spread beyond the initial individual Frau Trofea, with multiple other citizens of Strasbourg joining in within days of her initial outbreak. This wasn't an isolated incident. It became a group phenomenon, transforming from a curious anomaly into a public health or public order crisis. You see the official response unfolding. Messengers are sent, discussions are held in the council chambers. You might see officials looking stern and worried, observing the growing number of dancers from a safe distance. They're scratching their heads, debating among themselves. Some might propose religious explanations. God's wrath, the devil's work. Others might lean towards the medical theories of the time, though clearly none of their usual treatments for melancholy or fever seem applicable. And the dancing continues. The hired musicians arrive perhaps looking utterly bewildered as they play jaunty tunes for people who look like they're in agony. The rhythmic beat of the drums just seems to fuel the relentless movement. It doesn't look like fun, it looks like torture. People are stumbling, falling, getting back up, only to continue their frantic jig. Some accounts mention people collapsing from exhaustion, maybe even injury, but the compulsion is too strong to let them stop for long. The city is becoming a theater of the absurd, a strange, unsettling blend of mundane medieval life and this inexplicable, terrifying phenomenon. You go about your day maybe trying to sell your wares or tend your garden, but the background noise is now punctuated by the sounds of the relentless dancing, the shuffling feet, the heavy breathing, maybe the eerie, non-stop piping of the musicians. It's impossible to ignore. The number of dancers creeps up, from a handful to a dozen to 20. These are ordinary citizens, craftsmen, servants, merchants' wives, laborers, people from different walks of life, all afflicted by the same strange urge. You start to wonder who will be next. Could it happen to you? You find yourself unconsciously checking your own feet, making sure they aren't starting to tap to some unheard rhythm. A little chuckle to ease the tension, right? Imagine just spontaneously busting out into a macabre street performance you can't stop. Your social media would be a mess. The authorities' attempt to manage the situation by providing space and music is predictably a spectacular failure. Instead of helping, the visibility and perhaps the percussive rhythm of the music seem to encourage more people to join. It's almost as if the public display legitimizes the behavior in some twisted way, or perhaps the sheer spectacle draws in susceptible individuals. Or maybe the music just makes it physically easier to keep moving. Historians still argue over the exact psychological and social factors that contributed to the spread of the dancing once it began. Was it mass hysteria amplified by fear, social contagion, a shared response to underlying stress? The council's actions certainly didn't help. They inadvertently created a perfect storm for the epidemic to worsen. As the days turn into a week, the situation escalates dramatically. The few initial dancers are now dozens. The city square, or wherever the officials directed them, is becoming a scene of perpetual frantic motion. The initial strangeness has become a crisis. People aren't just dancing, they're dancing until they drop. Literally, the physical toll is immense. Exhaustion, dehydration, heart strain, foot injuries. These must be mounting, but they can't stop. They can't stop. You see the worried faces of the officials turning from confusion to desperation. Their brilliant plan of providing stages and music clearly backfired. This isn't going away. It's getting worse, much worse, and the city of Strasbourg is starting to panic. The dancing plague, as it would later be called, is now firmly established, a bizarre and terrifying reality that no one understands and no one seems able to stop. The stage is set for a much larger crisis, one that will engulf the city and leave a lasting, perplexing mark on history. The scene before you has transformed from a curious, unsettling spectacle into something far more overwhelming. Yesterday, it was a handful of lost souls, a dozen or so moving compulsively in a designated area, looking utterly spent. Today, it's a tide, an actual, undeniable human tide of relentless, agonizing movement. The number has exploded. Where there were dozens, there are now scores. Soon there will be hundreds. People who you saw walking normally just yesterday are now caught in the bizarre rhythm. The baker from down the street, the weaver from the next alley, even members of relatively well-off merchant families. They are all out there, caught in the same inexplicable grip. They don't gather in a neat, organized group. They fill squares, spill into narrower lanes, their shuffling feet a constant, unnerving soundtrack to the city's life. This isn't a festival. It's not a party. It's a horror show unfolding in slow, agonizing motion. The dancers look worse than ever. Their clothes are torn and sweat-stained, their hair matted to their faces. Their eyes are often wide and vacant or squeezed shut in what looks like sheer agony. You see people stumbling, colliding, falling. They scrape knees, twist ankles, but the compulsion is absolute. They get up perhaps with a groan and resume their relentless, pointless jig. It's a visceral, horrifying display of human endurance pushed far beyond its natural limits. The authorities' attempts to manage the situation by providing space and music, well, you saw how that went in the previous section. It didn't contain it, it seemingly amplified it. Maybe the music made the movement easier. Maybe the public display legitimized the urge for others. Maybe it was just awful timing and the contagion was going to spread anyway. Historians still argue fiercely over the specific triggers and amplifiers for the rapid spread of the dancing plague once Frau Trofea initiated it. Was it purely psychological stress in a difficult era, a form of mass suggestion or hysteria? Or were there other factors at play that we don't fully understand? Regardless, the effect of the city council's actions was catastrophic in hindsight. They essentially built a dance floor for a disease no one understood and invited more people to join the suffering. A real hold my beer and watch this terrible idea unfold moment for the 16th century city council. Panic is starting to grip Strasbourg. It's palpable in the air. You see it in the faces of your neighbors, in the way shopkeepers are starting to barricade their doors, in the hushed, terrified whispers exchanged on street corners. The everyday rhythm of life is completely disrupted. Who can focus on selling cheese or weaving cloth when dozens, soon hundreds of people are literally dancing themselves to death outside? The sound is constant now. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of feet, often accompanied by the unwelcome, maddeningly cheerful sound of the hired pipes and drums, which thankfully the authorities will soon realize is a terrible idea and get rid of. But for now, it's part of the Nightmare Symphony. People are afraid for themselves, of course. Will I catch it? Is it airborne? Does it come through the ground? Through eye contact, nobody knows. The fear of the unknown is often worse than the known threat, isn't it? And this is utterly, bafflingly unknown. You might catch someone quickly crossing the street to avoid getting too close to a group of dancers, their face a mask of fear and superstition. Is it God's punishment? Is it witchcraft? Demonic possession? These are the questions being whispered because sensible explanations seem utterly inadequate. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniably the rapid escalation in the number of people afflicted. Within weeks of the initial case estimates vary, but certainly hundreds, possibly up to 400 people, were caught in the throes of the compulsive dancing. This wasn't just a few isolated cases. It was a significant portion of the city's population experiencing this bizarre, debilitating, and often fatal condition. Imagine living in a city where 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 people were just dancing uncontrollably day and night. It's a scale that transitions this from a medical or psychological anomaly to a genuine societal crisis. The city officials, the magistrates and councilmen you saw looking worried before, are now in a state of near total desperation. Their initial misguided attempt to manage it has failed spectacularly. What do you do when hundreds of citizens are literally dancing themselves to death? You can't arrest them. They're not criminals. They're clearly suffering. You can't easily treat them. They can't stop moving. And anyway, medieval medicine had no concept of a dancing sickness. They are utterly out of their depth. Quirky tidbit time faced with this escalating crisis and having discarded the more dancing is the answer approach, thankfully, the city council decided to try something else. Based on the prevailing belief that the dancing might be caused by demonic possession or a curse, they turned to religious authorities for help. They decided the solution was public penance prayer and religious rituals. They ordered the removal of the stages and musical instruments, realizing the sound might be making things worse finally. They also decided to escort the most severely afflicted dancers to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, located near the town of Saverne, a short journey away. Saint Vitus was invoked against nervous system disorders and specifically against the dancing mania, which had occurred sporadically in Europe before. The idea was that the saint's intercession might cure them. So you might witness the bizarre sight of officials perhaps looking extremely uncomfortable, attempting to round up groups of exhausted, still dancing people. They would then be taken presumably by cart or aided by strong men toward the shrine. Imagine the scene, a procession of utterly spent, stumbling dancers being led through the streets, perhaps muttering prayers or still trapped in their movements on their way to seek divine intervention. It's both tragic and, in a dark historical irony kind of way, almost surrealistically absurd. A desperate measure born of fear and a complete lack of understanding. It's like trying to cure a modern virus with ancient incantations and a pilgrimage. Utterly ineffective, but it was all they had. The impact on daily life in Strasbourg is profound. Trade suffers. People are afraid to leave their homes. Markets are emptier. The constant presence of the dancers is a physical and psychological burden on everyone. You can't escape it. Their shuffling feet, their strained gasps, the terrifying knowledge that this could happen to anyone. It hangs over the city like a dark cloud. You might find yourself walking a longer route to avoid a square full of dancers, or peering cautiously from behind your shutters before venturing out. The officials' new plan, prayer and pilgrimage to St. Vitus, is implemented with a sense of urgency. They are desperate to show they are doing something, anything to appease God, or drive away the perceived evil causing this. The historical records mention processions, public prayers, and the transportation of dancers to the shrine. While some accounts suggest a few people might have recovered after visiting the shrine, perhaps the sheer exhaustion and the break from the urban environment helped some susceptible individuals. It was clearly not a cure-all. The main body of the plague continued to rage in Strasbourg. The sheer number of new dancers overwhelmed the city's limited capacity to manage this pilgrimage solution anyway. You can't take hundreds of severely ill, non-compliant people on a trip to another town easily in the 16th century. The city is a place of fear, confusion, and overwhelming physical suffering. The sights and sounds of the dancing plague are everywhere. You see families trying desperately to restrain loved ones who have started to dance, pleading with them to stop, only to watch in horror as the compulsion proves too strong. You see the grim faces of officials trying to decide what to do next. Their initial confidence replaced by abject failure. And the dancing continues, day after day, night after night. People are literally dancing until their hearts give out, until they collapse from dehydration, until injury prevents them from continuing. Accounts from the time speak of people dying, while dancing, their bodies finally giving out under the impossible strain. It's a mass tragedy unfolding in public, and no one knows how to make it stop. The city's resources, its social fabric, its collective sanity are all being tested to the breaking point by this bizarre, relentless phenomenon. The scale of the affliction is the defining characteristic of this phase. It has moved from a localized oddity to a citywide catastrophe. And as you look out at the shuffling, suffering crowds, you can't help but wonder how much worse it can possibly get before it finally ends. The city air, once thick with the smell of baking bread and tanning leather, now carries a constant undertone of something else. It's the sickly sweet scent of exertion, amplified by fear and despair. The St. Vitus pilgrimage, that desperate gamble on divine intervention you witnessed preparations for, has not proven to be the swift miracle the city fathers prayed for. You see processions of the afflicted being helped along, or sometimes still moving under their own terrible power, towards the road leading to Saverne, looking utterly spent, their eyes hollow. And you see others returning, perhaps a few, looking a little calmer, perhaps having collapsed from sheer exhaustion on the journey, but many still trapped in the same relentless motion, brought back because they couldn't be cured, or worse, brought back because they had died along the way. The logistics alone are a nightmare. Trying to physically move hundreds of people who cannot stop moving, who are weak from exhaustion and dehydration across even a relatively short distance in the 16th century, it's practically impossible on a mass scale. Imagine trying to get a group of marathon runners halfway through mile 26, completely depleted, but compelled to keep jogging onto carts and wagons and transport them somewhere. It's a logistical and humanitarian disaster. So while the St. Vitus plan might have offered a flicker of hope in practice, it did little to stem the rising tide of dancers within Strasbourg itself. The scene is reaching its horrifying zenith. The squares are packed, yes, but now the smaller streets and alleys are also filled with individuals or small groups caught in the grip. You cannot walk far in any direction without encountering them. Their relentless rhythmic movements are the new heartbeat of the city, a morbid, terrifying pulse. The sound of scraping feet and ragged breathing is everywhere. It permeates the silence of the night, it drowns out conversations during the day. Sleep is difficult, not just because of the noise, but because the sheer horror of it all gnaws at your mind. You find yourself flinching at sudden movements, your own legs feeling strangely restless. This is the peak. This is when the crisis goes from alarming to utterly catastrophic. Death is no longer an occasional outcome. It is a frequent occurrence. You see people collapse, simply cease moving their bodies, giving out. They might fall onto the cobblestones with a thud or stumble into a wall and slide down. Sometimes you see others still moving around them, their faces vacant, seemingly oblivious to the fallen body at their feet. It's an image of utter dehumanization of the individual subsumed by this monstrous collective compulsion. The city council is in a state of utter panic. Their religious gamble hasn't worked. Their initial baffling attempt to encourage it made things worse. They are running out of ideas and the death toll is mounting. Accounts from the time describe mass burials becoming necessary. This wasn't just 1 or 2 deaths a day, it was dozens. Imagine the scene carts piled high with bodies moving grimly towards the cemeteries. Funerals become commonplace, but perhaps muted, overshadowed by the ongoing, horrifying spectacle. It's hard to properly mourn when the source of the death is still dancing down the street. A mainstream historical fact about this period is the estimated death toll during the peak of the Strasbourg dancing plague. While exact figures from the time are always difficult to verify, precisely contemporary accounts suggest that at its height, the plague was claiming roughly 15 lives per day. That's a significant number in a medieval city of Strasbourg's size. Over the weeks, the plague raged intensely. This would have amounted to hundreds of deaths directly attributable to the uncontrollable dancing, from sheer exhaustion, heart attack, stroke, or perhaps secondary complications from injuries sustained while flailing and falling. This wasn't just a psychological oddity. It was a genuine, deadly public health crisis, even if the disease manifested in a way utterly alien to modern understanding. 15 deaths a day from dancing. It sounds like something from a particularly grim Monty Python sketch, except it was horrifyingly real. The fear morphs into something else now, a kind of numb despair for many. What can you do? Barricade your doors? Try to flee the city. Some likely did try to leave, but the surrounding countryside might have been wary of refugees from the cursed city, or simply too dangerous to travel through anyway. Most people were stuck, forced to witness this unfolding nightmare. The social fabric begins to fray completely. Neighbors are terrified of neighbors. Superstitions run rampant. Is it a curse on the city? Has God abandoned them? Has the devil himself taken residence in the town square? The authorities, bless their panicked hearts, realize they need a new approach. Religious processions and saintly pilgrimages aren't stopping the dying. They finally start to consider other possibilities. The scholarly debate here often revolves around why the authorities finally shifted their strategy. Was it simply the undeniable failure of the religious approach and the mounting death toll that forced a pragmatic shift? Or were there other factors, perhaps the advice of physicians limited as their understanding was, or a growing consensus that this wasn't purely spiritual? Historians still argue whether the shift was a result of rational observation, forcing a change in medieval belief, or simply a desperate move when one set of rituals proved ineffective. The quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to one of the prevailing beliefs about the cause of the dancing plague that wasn't purely spiritual. Beyond demonic possession or divine punishment, some people believed the dancing mania was caused by hot blood. This was a concept in medieval medicine tied to the humoral theory, which held that an imbalance of bodily fluids, humors, caused illness. Hot blood was associated with fever, agitation, and excessive movement. So alongside prayers and pilgrimages, you might hear whispers of this hot blood theory circulating. Imagine the treatment this might imply. Perhaps bleeding the afflicted, a common medieval practice for almost everything, or trying to cool them down. It highlights the desperate, often contradictory mix of spiritual, superstitious, and rudimentary medical explanations people grasped at to understand something utterly inexplicable to them. Yeah, I think old man Johannes just has too much spicy fever blood making him jig. Maybe we should try letting some out or giving him a really cold bath. It sounds absurd to us, but in a world without germ theory or psychology as we know it, it was a genuine attempt to make sense of madness. The authorities, moving beyond purely religious measures, eventually start to take more practical, albeit still ill-informed steps. They order the stages and instruments removed permanently. The sound of the pipes and drums, which had added such a bizarre, macabre soundtrack to the suffering, is finally silenced. This provides a small measure of relief, replacing the unsettling rhythm with only the sound of feet and groans. They also begin to implement measures to physically isolate the dancers. This isn't done out of an understanding of contagion in the modern sense, but perhaps a mix of fear, a desire to contain the disturbing spectacle, and maybe even a rudimentary recognition that something about the environment or the presence of others might be exacerbating it. You might see officials, perhaps aided by volunteers who haven't succumbed, trying to gently or not so gently guide dancers into designated areas, perhaps barns or other enclosed spaces outside the main city squares. The idea is to separate them from the general population, maybe to make it easier to care for them, or perhaps simply to get them out of sight, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of normalcy or at least control over the city's public spaces. It's a heartbreaking scene. People being corralled like livestock, still caught in their unstoppable, self-destructive dance. The effort is monumental and likely often futile. How do you contain someone who is compelled to move non-stop? They would pound on doors, shuffle endlessly within their confinement, their torment unabated, and the flow of new dancers doesn't immediately stop. Even as some succumb and die, others are still being drawn into the bizarre phenomenon. The city is caught in a terrible loop. More people dance, more people die. The authorities try inadequate measures, the fear deepens, the dancing continues. The sheer physical toll on the dancers is horrific to witness. Their feet are swollen and bleeding, their clothes are rags soaked with sweat and grime. Their faces are masks of pain and exhaustion, often twisted into grotesque parodies of movement. You see people stumble and fall, skinning knees and hands, but the compulsion is so strong, they pick themselves up sometimes with visible effort and agony and resume their relentless shuffling. It's a testament to the terrifying power of whatever force is driving them, psychological, physical, or otherwise, that they can endure such punishment and continue. The air itself feels heavy, burdened by the collective suffering. The normal sounds of a thriving medieval city, the chatter of merchants, the cries of street vendors, the laughter of children, are muted, replaced by the constant, unnerving backdrop of the dancing plague. Children are likely kept indoors, windows are shuttered, and the streets outside of where the dancers are eerily empty, save for those who must venture out. As the peak of the crisis rages, the authorities find themselves navigating uncharted territory. They are dealing with something completely outside the realm of their experience and understanding. Their initial religious and logistical responses have failed. The death toll is undeniable. The city is crippled by fear and disruption. What do you do when your citizens are literally dancing themselves to death in the streets and neither prayer nor confinement seems to stop it? This is the desperate question hanging over the magistrates of Strasbourg during the terrifying summer of 1518. The worst is unfolding, but the need for a more effective, or perhaps just different, response is becoming blindingly obvious. The city needs a miracle or failing that a different kind of intervention entirely. The air is quieter now, though the relentless shuffle and groan of the dancers remains the dominant sound. The city authorities, having seen their religious interventions spectacularly fail, are casting about for new ideas, like someone desperately fumbling for their keys in the dark. The peak death rate, that grim 15 souls a day statistic you heard about, was a cold splash of reality that washed away much of the mystical or purely punitive interpretations that might have initially held sway. This wasn't just a few possessed individuals. This was a mass phenomenon causing mass fatalities. When prayer didn't work and the dancing only seemed to intensify, pragmatism, born of terror, began to creep in. So where do you turn when God seems unresponsive and the devil's influence is too widespread to exorcise one by one? To the doctors, of course, or as they were known then, physicians and healers working with a medical understanding that was, shall we say, less sophisticated than hitting diagnose on your smartphone. You might see stern-faced men in darker robes, perhaps carrying bags of herbs or shiny if crude surgical tools being ushered into the council chambers. These are the minds meant to tackle physical ailments, but this is something else entirely. Their medical framework is primarily the ancient Greek humoral theory refined over centuries. Remember the hot blood idea mentioned earlier? That's part of it. The body is seen as a balance of four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Imbalances in these humors caused by diet, environment, or even spiritual factors were believed to lead to disease. So when faced with people compelled to dance uncontrollably, the physicians wouldn't think of neurotransmitters or mass psychogenic illness. They'd think, which humor is out of whack here? Is it an excess of hot, agitated blood? Perhaps a surfeit of black bile causing melancholy and strange compulsions? You listen as they discuss possibilities. Their language is dense with terms like plethora, melancholia, and distemper of the humors. They examine the dancers cautiously, probably keeping a safe distance, watching their movements, perhaps feeling their pulses, which must have been racing, and observing their pallor or sweat. They'd likely ask questions, though getting coherent answers from someone lost in a dancing trance would be challenging, to say the least. Maybe they'd question family members or neighbors trying to piece together symptoms and possible causes based on their humoral framework. A mainstream historical fact that emerges from this period is that the city council, upon the advice of local physicians, officially shifted their strategy away from purely religious penance and towards measures aimed at treating the dancers as if they were suffering from a physical ailment specifically linked to hot blood. This was a significant pivot. It wasn't a perfect understanding, far from it, but it marked a move from "they are cursed by God" to "they are suffering from an internal imbalance that needs correction." It shows a glimmer of rational problem solving even within the confines of medieval medicine. It's like deciding your possessed computer needs a new graphics card instead of an exorcism. Small step, but in the right direction? Maybe. Based on the hot blood diagnosis, the recommended treatments were designed to cool and calm the body and crucially allow the excess heat to dissipate. What did this involve? Well, for starters, they advised against the very thing the council had initially encouraged: public dancing. They reinforced the ban on musicians in public performances, recognizing, perhaps through simple observation, that the music seemed to exacerbate the condition. It's a bit late for that, you think wryly, watching someone doing the Macarena of Doom in the street. But okay, better late than never. They also suggested environmental changes. The council ordered that the stages and platforms previously erected for the dancers should be dismantled immediately and permanently. Get rid of anything that looks like a dance floor. You see, laborers likely hired under duress or offered hefty sums if the city coffers weren't already empty, nervously going about this task, sometimes having to dodge or work around the afflicted. The atmosphere in the squares begins to change subtly without the raised platforms and the memory of the music, but the underlying problem persists. Other recommendations were more directly aimed at the dancers themselves, rooted in humoral theory. If it's hot blood, you need to cool it down. This could involve specific diets, avoiding rich, spicy foods that were thought to increase heat, and prescribing cooling foods like lettuce, plums, and cherries. Imagine trying to get a person who hasn't stopped moving for days and is probably barely conscious to sit down and eat a bowl of cooling fruit salad. It's almost comical if it wasn't so utterly tragic. Here you go, sir. Have a nice cooling plum. Just stop dancing for a second, would you? Yeah, good luck with that. A quirkier, more fringe tidbit that surfaces around this time relates to the idea of providing physical relief to the dancers in a way that still allowed the affliction to run its course, but perhaps with less fatal outcome. Some accounts suggest that alongside the cooling treatments, there was a belief that the dancers needed to, in essence, dance it out, that the compulsion had to be exhausted from the body. This led to the incredibly grim idea of potentially creating controlled environments where the dancers could continue until they were spent, but hopefully with some support. This is where historians still argue whether the council truly embraced the idea of dancing it out as a treatment prescribed by physicians, or if it was a desperate concession to the reality that they couldn't stop the dancing, so they might as well try to make it slightly less deadly. Was it a medical strategy, a containment measure, or just throwing their hands up? This ambiguity in the historical record is fascinating. Did the doctors actually say yes, let them dance, but put them somewhere safe? and maybe hose them down occasionally? Or did the council just misinterpret the need for dissipating heat as let them continue their sweaty, exhausting movement? Historians still argue whether the dance it out approach was a legitimate, though flawed medical recommendation, rooted in humoral theory or a pragmatic, despairing response born from the failure of all other methods. It's hard to know if the physicians genuinely believed this was a cure, or if they were just as bewildered as everyone else, offering advice that sounded vaguely scientific while hoping for the best. The shift in strategy, however muddled, represents a crucial moment. The city council, and by extension, society's perception of the dancing plague, began to move, albeit slowly and imperfectly, away from purely supernatural or punitive explanations and towards the realm of physical or mental illness, however misunderstood. You see the signs of this shift in the types of conversations happening on the street, whispered, fearful as they are. Less talk of demons and divine wrath, more talk of humors, fever, and exhaustion. The challenge, of course, is implementing these new ideas, trying to enforce dietary changes on people who are dancing nonstop, trying to provide cool environments. These are Herculean tasks when the afflicted are in constant, often violent motion. And the most challenging aspect, the one they seem to be building towards, is the idea of isolating the dancers, not just to get them out of the squares, but perhaps as part of this controlled environment approach. You feel a faint sense of dread building. Containing people who cannot stop moving sounds like a recipe for escalating chaos, not calm. But the physicians have given their advice, limited and strange as it is, and the council, desperate for any alternative to the current catastrophe, is ready to act on it. The next phase of the city's response is about to begin shifting from misguided encouragement and failed prayer to flawed medical theory and the grim task of managing the unstoppable motion. The dancing hasn't stopped, but the official approach to dealing with it has fundamentally changed, and the outcomes are still very much in doubt. The air is thick with a different kind of tension now. Less purely panicked chaos, more the grim, determined, but ultimately futile effort of trying to herd cats made of pure, relentless, kinetic energy. The city council, having received the physician's diagnosis and recommendations, is now tasked with the monumental, nay Sisyphean effort of putting those ideas into practice. Remember that shift from praying to prescribing. This is where the rubber meets the road, or perhaps where the non-stop shuffling feet meet the cobblestones, leaving weariness and despair in their wake. So the decision is made to act on the physician's advice. If it's hot blood and the need to dance it out, then the environment must be controlled. You see city officials looking even more harried than before issuing orders. Messengers are dispatched, sometimes having to shout over the distant, constant thud of feet. Decrees are posted, though. Who has time to read decrees when their neighbor is literally dancing themselves to death? The primary practical measure derived from the medical advice was the attempt to create controlled environments for the dancers. The logic, however, twisted by medieval medical theory, was that if the dancing was a compulsion that needed to be expelled from the body, the dancing it out idea, then the afflicted should be allowed or even encouraged to continue, but in a place where they wouldn't endanger themselves or others, and where they might receive some basic care. It sounds benevolent on paper, like setting up a designated mosh pit for the plague-stricken, but the reality was far more harrowing. One mainstream historical fact about this phase is that the city council specifically designated public spaces, including market squares and even certain guild halls, to serve as improvised dancing areas. The idea was to gather the dancers together, providing a central location where they could be monitored, potentially offered water if anyone could get them to drink, and kept away from residential streets where they might collapse on doorsteps or obstruct what little commerce remained. It was a desperate attempt at containment, a way to concentrate the problem rather than solve it. Imagine this process playing out. City guards, probably extremely reluctant in keeping a wide berth, are tasked with gently, or perhaps not so gently, coaxing or corralling the dancers towards these designated zones. You witness heartbreaking scenes, families trying to stay with their loved ones, sometimes pulled along by the relentless movement, sometimes collapsing in despair at the edge of the designated zone, unable to follow or help. The air in these areas is thick with the sounds of hundreds, maybe thousands of shuffling, stamping, groaning feet. The stench of sweat, fear, and sickness hangs heavy. Inside these controlled zones, the chaos is immense. People are packed together, still locked in their individual involuntary dances. Some move with frenetic energy, others stumble and lurch. There are falls, collisions, and the constant risk of being trampled. The city tries to provide some level of support. Perhaps large vats of water are set up, though getting a dancer to stop and drink is nigh impossible. Crude shelters might be erected at the edges, offering a brief respite for exhausted carers or officials. But the dancers themselves remain exposed to the elements day and night. This is where the dancing it out concept truly comes into grim focus. The intention influenced by the humoral theory's idea of expelling excess heat or agitation was to allow the compulsion to run its course. But the execution was simply creating holding pens for the dying. It was a passive form of treatment that relied on the patients literally exhausting themselves into submission or more likely death. It's like being told your car engine is overheating and the mechanic suggests you just drive it until it cools down naturally. Genius. A quirky or fringe tidbit emerging from this phase as accounts filtered out was the description of makeshift dance floors being prepared even within these designated areas. Some chroniclers mention straw being spread, perhaps intended to soften falls or soak up sweat and bodily fluids. Others talk of barriers being erected not just to keep people in, but maybe to create some semblance of order. A grim parody of a medieval fairground dance troupe penned up for a performance that would never end. The very idea of preparing a surface for uncontrollable fatal dancing feels surreal, a macabre detail that highlights the helplessness and desperation of the authorities. You picture workers carefully laying down straw while figures lurch and stumble nearby, a tableau of utter despair. The logistical nightmares were endless. How do you feed people who can't stop moving? How do you provide sanitation? How do you deal with injuries from falls or exhaustion? The historical accounts suggest that efforts were minimal and largely ineffective. The focus was on containment and allowing the treatment exhaustion to proceed. Carers and volunteers likely few and far between due to fear of contagion, or simply the overwhelming horror, would attempt to tend to the most distressed, but it was a losing battle against the sheer physical toll of the dancing. Historians still argue whether the council's implementation of these controlled zones, based on the dance it out principle, was a genuine, if misguided, medical strategy, or simply the most practical way to manage an unmanageable crisis. Was it truly believed that dancing was the cure, and this was the best way to administer it? Or was it an admission of defeat? We can't stop them, so let's just put them somewhere less disruptive and hope they stop eventually by dying. This is where the lack of detailed primary sources leaves gaps. The council records might state they were following physicians' orders to allow the humors to expel through motion, but the lived reality for the officials and the dancers was far more brutal and likely less theoretically pure. Historians still argue whether this phase represents a flawed medical intervention or a desperate public health measure masquerading as treatment. It's a critical distinction highlighting the uncertainty surrounding the motivations and understanding of the time. Were they trying to heal or just mitigate the symptoms of societal disruption while the disease ran its course? The sounds emanating from these designated zones would have been appalling. Not just the shuffling and stamping, but cries of pain, moans of exhaustion, and the terrible ragged gasps for breath. Death was a constant companion. The 15 deaths a day statistic mentioned earlier. Those deaths were now concentrated in these zones, a grim harvest reaped by unstoppable motion. You can almost hear the death rattle lost in the relentless rhythm of the feet. Despite the physician's recommendations focusing on hot blood and humoral imbalance, the sheer strangeness of the phenomenon must have continued to fuel other interpretations. While the council might have officially adopted a medical framework, you can be sure whispers of curses, demonic influence, and divine punishment still circulated among the populace, perhaps even more intensely now seeing the medical solutions fail so spectacularly. The designated zones intended as places of treatment likely became seen by many as places of purgatory or confinement for the afflicted. The city's resources must have been stretched to breaking point, providing even minimal support for thousands of people who could not care for themselves, dealing with the mounting dead, maintaining some semblance of order. It was an impossible situation. The novelty of the spectacle had long worn off, replaced by a pervasive sense of dread and exhaustion that mirrored the physical state of the dancers themselves. The city was collectively holding its breath, watching the terrible slow-motion tragedy unfold in its squares and halls. And through it all, the dancing continued. The designated areas filled up, becoming scenes of overwhelming suffering. The strategy of dancing it out wasn't a cure, it was a form of managed decline. The physician's advice filtered through the practicalities of medieval urban administration, and the deep misunderstanding of the underlying cause had led not to recovery, but to a more organized way of dying. You can almost feel the oppressive atmosphere settling over the city. The hope that medical science, however rudimentary, might offer a solution is fading fast. The sheer scale of the problem is overwhelming any attempt at rational management. The next steps, if any, would have to be even more drastic, born of sheer desperation as the number of dead continued to rise, and the relentless, terrifying dance showed no sign of stopping on its own. The designated zones intended to contain became epicenters of the plague's terrible progress, leaving the authorities to ponder what other desperate measures they could possibly attempt. The strategy of containment of designating sad squares and guild halls as zones for involuntary self-exhaustion proved less a solution and more a way to concentrate the misery. The dancing didn't stop. It just became slightly more organized in its location, like redirecting a stampede into a slightly larger pen. The deaths continued, the suffering was immense, and the city council found themselves back where they started, desperate, confused, and needing a new idea. Remember the physician's report? The one about hot blood and humors needing to be expelled? This next idea, as outlandish as it sounds to our modern ears, sort of kind of, if you squint really hard, flows from that. If the body is compelled to move to dance out some internal imbalance, then maybe, just maybe, the external environment could influence that compulsion. If the problem was internal rhythm gone mad, perhaps external rhythm could tame it. So in a move that feels less like public health policy and more like a medieval record producer trying to find the right beat for a very, very difficult artist, the city council decided to hire musicians. Yes, you heard that right. Their brilliant next step was to add a soundtrack to the suffering. The logic, such as it was, seems to have been multifaceted or perhaps just muddled by panic. One line of thinking potentially linked back to the humoral theory, and the idea of expelling energy was that the dancing needed a channel. If the body must move, then giving it music might guide that motion, make it less chaotic, perhaps even make it therapeutic, like giving someone who can't stop pacing a treadmill and some headphones, except the treadmill is a cobbled square and the headphones are several noisy medieval musicians. It's a truly baffling application of theory, assuming it was even theory and not just a wild guess born of desperation. Another possible rationale steeped in the medieval understanding of sound and its effect on the body and spirit was that music held power. Perhaps the right kind of melodies or rhythms could soothe the agitated humors, calm the frantic nerves, or even counter whatever unseen, maybe even supernatural force was compelling the dance. Music Therapy Medieval Edition, featuring forced participation and a potentially fatal outcome. So a mainstream historical fact is that the city council did hire musicians to play for the dancers. They commissioned drummers, pipers, and other instrumentalists. Their instructions were presumably to play music that would accompany the ceaseless motion. Imagine the job posting: wanted musicians, must be able to play non-stop for days, ideally in loud, repetitive style. Experience serenading existential dread a plus. Hazard pay, TBD. It might have been the worst gig in Strasbourg's history, which given the history of Strasbourg is saying something. You picture these musicians, likely local townspeople or traveling performers, suddenly thrust into this horrifying scenario. Their usual audience probably consisted of merry wedding parties or pious churchgoers. Now they are tasked with providing the score for a real-life danse macabre. You see them setting up near the designated dancing zones, tuning their instruments, maybe exchanging nervous glances. There's a drum, perhaps a simple tabor meant to provide a steady driving beat. There might be a fife or pipe adding a reedy melody, maybe even a primitive violin or viola da gamba, providing a more complex layer of sound. The idea was to create a continuous musical backdrop, Relays of musicians might have been employed working in shifts to keep the sound going, day and night matching the dancers' relentless energy. The city paid them a small but significant expense in a time of crisis. It highlights the council's belief, however misplaced, that this was a necessary intervention. It wasn't cheap to hire a band for a seemingly endless, fatal rave. What kind of music did they play? This is one of those details lost to time, and historians still argue whether the council intended the music to be specifically fast and rhythmic to match the dancers' pace, or perhaps slower and more melodic in an attempt to calm them. Was it lively jig-like tunes trying to channel the energy constructively, or was it something more solemn, reflecting the grim reality? Primary sources are frustratingly vague, often just mentioning music or instruments. Did they play religious hymns hoping for divine intervention through sound? Or did they stick to secular tunes purely focused on the physical act of dancing? The ambiguity allows for much debate about the council's true intent and understanding of the phenomenon. You watch as the musicians begin to play. The first notes ring out, perhaps tentative at first, then settling into a relentless rhythm. Drums pounding, pipes skirling. It's meant to be a form of structure imposed upon chaos. But the dancers don't seem to care. Or do they? This is where the quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. Some accounts, though scarce and potentially embellished over time, suggest that the music did have some effect, albeit minor and perhaps fleeting. There are mentions that some dancers seem to subconsciously alter their steps or tempo to align with the music, as if their possessed bodies were trying to find some external synchronization. Other accounts state the dancers completely ignored the musicians, locked in their own internal silent rhythm of death. Imagine the musicians playing a lively tune while dancers lurch and stumble completely out of sync, their movements dictated by something far beyond a simple drum beat. It's a horrifying image, a live band playing to a mosh pit of doom. Did the music help? By all accounts, no. The dancing plague continued its grim progression. People still danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or heart failure. The music became part of the terrible soundscape of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, an absurd, desperate attempt to impose order on the uncontrollable. It was like trying to conduct a hurricane with a tiny baton. The musicians must have been traumatized, playing for days on end, watching people literally dance themselves to death just feet away. The repetitive nature of the music, the constant visual of suffering, it must have been a deeply unsettling experience. Were they paid enough to justify that kind of mental toll? Probably not by modern standards, but likely a decent wage for the time enough to make it worth enduring the horror. The council's decision to hire musicians highlights their fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. They were treating a symptom, the dancing, as the disease, and applying remedies based on medieval medical and spiritual theories that were utterly ill-equipped to handle this kind of mass psychogenic illness, or whatever its true cause might have been. They threw money at musicians when perhaps what was needed was quiet rest, hydration, and calming environments. But quiet rest wasn't an option for those compelled to move. And calming environments are hard to come by when you're in a public square, surrounded by hundreds of afflicted people and a relentlessly pounding drum. The combination of the designated zones and the continuous music created a bizarre spectacle. Outsiders arriving in Strasbourg might have been utterly bewildered seeing crowds of people shuffling uncontrollably in squares accompanied by live music that seemed utterly inappropriate for the scene. It was a performance art piece nobody wanted curated by sheer unadulterated panic. The sounds emanating from these zones were now a terrible symphony of suffering. The shuffling of feet, the moans and cries of the dancers, overlaid with the relentless, perhaps increasingly frantic efforts of the musicians trying to play loud enough to be heard, trying to find a rhythm that might somehow miraculously break the spell. You can almost feel the vibration of the drums through the cobblestones, a constant low thrum of dread permeating the city. This phase marked a pivot point. The initial panic had led to prayer and superstition. The official response, guided by physicians, had led to containment and misguided medical theory, letting them dance it out. Now the council was layering on another attempt, hoping that the external power of music could somehow counteract the internal compulsion. It was a mix of desperation and a medieval belief in the tangible effects of sound on the human body and mind. Historians still argue whether the music was primarily seen as a physical intervention, providing rhythm for a physical compulsion, a psychological one, distraction or channeling, or even a spiritual one, warding off demonic influence with ordered sound. Each interpretation sheds a different light on the medieval mindset and the desperate attempts to understand and combat this terrifying phenomenon. Was it a medical treatment, a public health measure, or an exorcism attempt carried out with lutes? The sources don't give us a clear answer, leaving room for scholarly debate and frustrating ambiguity. As the days bled into weeks, the musicians played on the dancers, shuffled and stumbled, and the death toll continued to climb. The music didn't cure, it didn't calm, and it certainly didn't make the dancing any less fatal. It simply provided a bizarre, haunting soundtrack to the ongoing tragedy. The failure of this measure would force the city council to contemplate even more drastic actions, abandoning the idea of facilitating the dance and moving towards outright suppression. But for now, the drums pounded, the pipes played, and the dance of death continued its relentless, terrifying performance under the summer sun. The musical experiment, bless its misguided heart, lasted only so long before its utter futility became painfully obvious. The relentless beat of the drums and the reedy wail of the pipes hadn't soothed the dancers. They had merely provided a chaotic, terrible soundtrack to their decline. People were still dancing, still collapsing, still dying. The designated dancing zones, far from being therapeutic outlets, had become grim stages for a never-ending involuntary performance of suffering. You picture the city council members gathered once again, faces etched with fatigue and despair. The physician's advice hadn't worked, the containment hadn't worked, and hiring a band to accompany the impending doom certainly hadn't worked. Their initial confidence, perhaps bolstered by the pseudo-medical theories of the time, had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of helplessness. What do you do when the best minds of the city, armed with the prevailing medical knowledge and a hefty dose of medieval superstition, have tried everything they can think of, and people are still literally dancing themselves to death in the streets? The mood in the council chambers must have been heavy, bordering on desperate. The crisis wasn't abating, it was deepening. The city's reputation was in tatters, the economy was suffering, and the humanitarian cost was mounting. The initial response, based on the belief that this was some sort of fever or internal imbalance that needed to be expelled through movement, had been a catastrophic failure. It was time for a radical shift in strategy. If facilitating the dance wasn't working, perhaps the opposite approach was needed. If the compulsion was the problem, maybe they needed to find a way to suppress it. This line of thinking, though perhaps less rooted in the humoral theories of the physicians and more in sheer abject panic, led to the council's next major decree. A mainstream historical fact is that the City Council of Strasbourg eventually issued a formal ban on public dancing and playing music. This was a stark reversal of their previous policy. They weren't just not hiring musicians anymore, they were actively prohibiting musical performances in public spaces. And they weren't just designating zones for dancing, they were forbidding public dancing altogether. The message was clear: stop moving, stop playing. You imagine the city criers, their voices strained, announcing the new edicts in the squares, where just days before, the terrible music had played. Hear ye, by order of the Honorable City Council, all public dancing is forbidden. All musical performances in the streets and squares are hereby prohibited. Just to rate, the announcement must have felt surreal, almost absurd, given that many people were literally incapable of stopping. How do you ban something that people are being forced to do against their will? It's like banning blinking, but with fatal consequences. The logic, flawed as it might seem, was likely multifaceted. Forbidding music directly countered their previous failed strategy. If the music wasn't helping, and perhaps was even fueling the frenzied motion, a possibility they might have considered in their desperation, then removing it seemed logical. The ban on public dancing was more complex. It couldn't stop those already afflicted, but perhaps it was intended to prevent others from joining in, or to create an environment where the dancers felt more isolated and less part of a horrifying involuntary flash mob. This move also reflects a possible shift in the council's understanding, or rather their lack of understanding. If it wasn't a medical issue solvable by dancing it out, maybe it was something else, something contagious, something spiritual. Removing the external stimuli of music and forbidding the collective public act of dancing might have been seen as a way to break the chain of whatever was spreading this affliction. It was an attempt to regain control, to impose order through prohibition when facilitation had failed spectacularly. The enforcement of these bans must have presented immense challenges. How do you enforce a no dancing rule on someone who cannot stop dancing? Were guards posted? Did they try to physically restrain people? Accounts from the time are less detailed on the how of enforcement and more focused on the fact that the ban was issued. You picture confused, perhaps terrified city watchmen attempting to guide or even carry away people who were compelled to shuffle and sway against their will. It's a darkly comedic image, the medieval version of a bouncer telling someone to leave the club because they won't stop dad dancing, except the dad dancing will kill you. Okay, that was maybe a little too dark, sorry. Let's lighten it up. Imagine trying to give someone a parking ticket because their legs won't stop doing the cha-cha slide. Better, the quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to the unintended consequences and the sheer impossibility of the ban. While public music was prohibited, it's likely that some forms of private music persisted. More interestingly, some accounts suggest that the ban inadvertently shifted the dancing. Instead of congregating in the official now outlawed squares, some afflicted individuals or smaller groups might have retreated to less visible areas like alleys or private courtyards, trying to escape the authorities while still compelled to move. The ban didn't stop the dancing, it just made it less public, potentially hiding the suffering away from official view and hindering any further more effective interventions. It was like trying to cure a contagious disease by telling people not to cough in public. Another aspect of this phase is the potential for the ban to increase the psychological distress of the dancers. Imagine being compelled to dance, knowing that the authorities now view your involuntary movements as a crime or a public nuisance. You're already trapped in your own body, and now the city is telling you to stop doing the very thing you cannot stop. It adds a layer of anxiety and fear onto the already horrific physical ordeal. Historians still argue whether this ban had any significant effect on the course of the dancing plague. Did the removal of music, however ineffective it seemed, eventually contribute to the decline in cases? Or was the plague already beginning to run its course due to other factors like the sheer exhaustion and death of the most susceptible? Some scholars argue that the ban on public gathering points and music, while not stopping the afflicted, might have reduced the psychological contagion aspect for onlookers, preventing new people from being drawn into the phenomenon. Others maintain that the bans were largely symbolic or even counterproductive, making the situation worse for the dancers. The historical record doesn't provide a neat cause and effect leaving room for considerable scholarly debate on the true impact of these prohibitions. This shift in policy represents a movement from medical intervention, facilitating expulsion of humors via dance and music, to what looks more like a public order or perhaps even spiritual intervention, banning the outward manifestations of the affliction. If dancing was seen as potentially linked to demonic influence or uncontrolled passion, then banning it might have been viewed as a way to fight back against such forces. It's a confusing blend of medieval beliefs, administrative panic, and utter desperation. You see the city watchmen awkward in their attempts to enforce the impossible ban. They might try to gently persuade dancers to stop, or perhaps more forcefully try to pull them away, only to find the compulsion seemingly irresistible. The sight of authorities struggling with people who appear to be willingly defying them, when in fact they are utterly powerless over their own bodies, must have added another layer of tragedy and absurdity to the scene. The citizens watching this spectacle, those unaffected, must have felt a complex mix of fear, pity, and confusion. The ban also affected the musicians themselves. Suddenly out of a job, the one they probably hated, admittedly, they were now also prohibited from playing their instruments publicly at all. This suggests the council might have entertained the idea that the sound itself was somehow problematic, either amplifying the affliction or being an expression of it. It shows how little they truly understood. They were flailing, grasping at any potential lever to stop the unstoppable. Despite the bans, the dancing didn't immediately cease. It likely became more sporadic, less concentrated, but just as deadly for those still caught in its grip. The public soundscape changed. The continuous music was gone, replaced by a terrible quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic shuffling of feet and the moans of the afflicted. The silence itself might have been just as unsettling as the earlier music, highlighting the unnaturalness of the ongoing compulsion. The effectiveness of the ban remains a key point of scholarly debate. Some historians point to the fact that the plague did eventually subside after these measures were put in place, suggesting correlation if not direct causation. They argue that disrupting the public nature of the phenomenon might have broken the psychological feedback loop. Others are more skeptical, attributing the decline to the natural limits of human endurance or the eventual exhaustion of the population most susceptible to such mass psychogenic illness. Without definitive evidence, the argument continues. Regardless of its actual effect, the ban on music and dancing marked a significant turning point in the city's response. It was an admission of failure for the previous facilitation strategy and a desperate pivot toward suppression. It highlighted the council's evolving and still deeply flawed understanding of the crisis. They had tried to dance with the devil, and now they were trying to tell the devil to sit down and be quiet. Neither approach seemed to be working particularly well, and the grim dance of death continued its horrifying silent procession through the streets of Strasbourg. The next steps would be born out of even greater desperation and a return to more overtly spiritual explanations and interventions. So the drumming didn't work. The pipes didn't work, banning the music and the dancing outright didn't work. You're the city council. You've tried facilitating it, you've tried forbidding it, and people are still staggering through the streets. Their limbs moving against their will, collapsing from exhaustion or worse. The secular options, the quasi-medical theories about balancing humors through vigorous movement, the attempts at public order through prohibition, they had all failed utterly and spectacularly. The atmosphere in Strasbourg wasn't just fearful anymore. It was desperate. When earthly remedies fail against a plague that defies understanding, where do people often turn in a deeply religious age? Exactly. To the heavens, or perhaps to the saints. The mood in the city began to shift from one of administrative panic and failed medical intervention to one of spiritual introspection and fear. If this wasn't a fever or a problem with the body's internal balance that dancing could fix, what was it? The prevailing worldview of the time offered plenty of other terrifying possibilities. Could it be a punishment from God for some collective sin? Could it be the work of the devil possessing the unfortunate souls? Could it be a curse, perhaps witchcraft? In the medieval mind, these were not metaphorical questions. They were very real and deeply frightening explanations for phenomena that defied rational understanding. The focus naturally shifted to the church. The religious leaders, the priests, the bishops, the monastic orders, they held sway over the spiritual realm, the one place that might offer protection or a cure against forces that the city council and physicians clearly couldn't comprehend, let alone control. This phase of the response marks a return to the deeply ingrained religious beliefs that underpin society. If science, or what passed for it, had failed, it was time for faith to take over. The mainstream historical fact that defines this shift is the organized effort to seek intervention from a specific saint known for his association with conditions involving involuntary movement, Saint Vitus. There was a popular belief in the Rhineland area that afflictions like epilepsy, chorea, a neurological disorder causing involuntary jerky movements, sometimes called Saint Vitus's dance, and other nervous disorders could be cured through the intercession of Saint Vitus. His shrine at Saverne, now in France, but historically within the region, and accessible from Strasbourg, became the focal point of hope. You picture the discussions among the city's religious and civic leaders. They would have considered various possibilities, perhaps public masses, fasting prayer vigils. But the cult of Saint Vitus offered a more direct avenue, a saint whose very reputation was built on healing this kind of affliction. The decision was made the afflicted dancers, or at least a significant number of them, would be taken on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus. It was an act of profound faith, a desperate gamble, and an immense logistical challenge. How do you organize a pilgrimage of people who can't stop moving, who might collapse or die along the way? The pilgrimage itself is a striking image. You imagine the scene carts being gathered, perhaps some specially adapted, to carry those too weak to walk or too uncontrollably violent in their movements. people being gently or perhaps not so gently guided onto these vehicles or herded towards the road to Saverne. The road wasn't long by modern standards, maybe 30-40 miles, but for people in their condition, it was an ordeal. Some likely continued to dance or twitch even while being transported. Others, weaker, might have been slumped eyes wide with fear or exhaustion. The unaffected citizens would have watched this grim procession depart a mixture of hope and dread in their hearts. Hope that this sacred journey, this act of faith, might finally bring an end to the terror. Dread at the sight of their neighbors, friends, and family members being carted away, still trapped in their horrifying performance. It must have felt less like a hopeful journey and more like transporting the living dead. Upon arrival at Saverne, the afflicted were brought to the shrine of Saint Vitus. The rituals performed here were central to the medieval belief in saintly healing. This included prayers offered to Saint Vitus touching relics associated with the saint, often said to be his bones or objects he touched, and sometimes washing in blessed water or participating in special masses. A quirky or fringe tidbit associated with Saint Vitus and his cult was the belief that offering specific items could aid in healing. For afflicted dancers, this often involved offering shoes or slippers to the shrine after their recovery. You imagine piles of worn-out shoes accumulating at the shrine, tangible proof of the suffering and the hope for cure. It's a strange, poignant detail. The footwear of involuntary dancers, symbols of their torment left behind, as tokens of gratitude or desperate pleas. You picture the scuffs, the holes, the sweat-stained leather, each pair telling a silent, terrible story. The rituals at the shrine were likely physically and emotionally intense. The environment was charged with religious fervor, the air thick with incense chanting and the murmurs of prayers. For the afflicted already in an altered physical and mental state, this setting could have been profoundly impactful. Being surrounded by others seeking the same cure, participating in ancient rituals, it could have created a powerful sense of collective hope, or perhaps simply added another layer of sensory overload to their already tormented minds. Besides the main pilgrimage to Saverne, there were likely other localized religious efforts within Strasbourg itself. Processions through the city carrying holy relics or images of saints intended to purify the streets and ward off evil influences. Special masses asking for divine mercy. Increased emphasis on prayer and penance among the unaffected population, perhaps believing that their collective sin had brought this scourge upon them. It was a city turning to the spiritual realm, casting aside the failed secular solutions like discarded crutches. Historians still argue whether the pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine and the associated religious interventions were the true turning point in the dancing plague. Some scholars argue that the change in environment, the powerful suggestion of the religious setting, the collective ritual, and the sheer exhaustion from the journey itself might have contributed to the cessation of dancing for some individuals. They suggest it worked not necessarily through supernatural means, but through a form of mass psychogenic suggestion and the placebo effect providing a narrative framework for recovery and a physical and mental break from the stressful urban environment. Being told you will be cured by Saint Vitus, surrounded by others who believe the same, might have been a powerful psychological force. Other historians are more skeptical, arguing that the plague was already beginning to wane due to the natural course of such phenomena or the death of the most severely afflicted. They might point out that not everyone who went on the pilgrimage was cured, and the dancing didn't cease overnight for the entire population. They might suggest the decline was coincidental with the religious interventions, rather than caused by them, perhaps influenced by environmental factors, changes in diet, or simply the passage of time exhausting the phenomenon. This scholarly debate highlights the difficulty in attributing cause and effect in historical events, especially those involving complex psychological and social factors like mass hysteria or psychogenic illness. Was it faith fatigue suggestion or something else entirely? The historical record provides accounts of people ceasing to dance after visiting the shrine, which could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on one's perspective. The return to spiritual intervention underscores how medieval society grappled with inexplicable crises. When rational by their standards or administrative solutions failed, the default was often to seek divine favor or protection. The dancing plague, so bizarre and terrifying, seemed to demand a spiritual explanation and a spiritual remedy. It wasn't just a physical ailment. It felt like a spiritual attack, a disruption of the natural and divine order. You imagine the atmosphere around the shrine, a strange mix of fervent hope and abject misery. People stumbling, praying, crying, some perhaps collapsing at the foot of the altar, hoping for a miracle. Priests performing rituals, their voices resonating with authority and belief. The unaffected accompanying the sick, offering support, participating in the prayers burdened by their own fear and sympathy. It was a scene of profound human vulnerability played out against the backdrop of deeply held religious conviction. The journey back from Severn would have been different for those who found relief. Imagine the quiet carts, the people sitting still for the first time in weeks, perhaps, weeping with relief or simply numb with exhaustion. For others, the return journey might have been as tormented as the trip there, a crushing disappointment confirming that even divine intervention or the most powerful saint could not free them from their internal prison. The accounts suggest that after this period of intense religious focus and the pilgrimage to St. Vitus, the number of dancers did begin to decline more significantly. Whether it was the saint's intercession, the psychological power of the rituals, or the sheer toll the dancing had taken, the plague finally seemed to be losing its grip on Strasbourg. But the scars, both physical and psychological, would undoubtedly linger. The city had danced with madness, tried to ban it, and then sought divine help, and the mystery of what had truly transpired would echo through history. So the wagons creaked their way to Severn, laden with their strangely afflicted cargo, and prayers were offered, rituals performed, and offerings made at the shrine of St. Vitus. The hopes of a terrified city were riding on these acts of faith. And then slowly, account by account, person by person, something began to change. It wasn't like flipping a switch. The music didn't just stop and everyone immediately freeze mid-jig. No, it seems to have been a more gradual process, a tapering off like a frantic dying fire eventually burning itself out. Historical accounts from chroniclers of the time, like those found in the Chronica of the city of Strasbourg, or later summaries, suggest that after the pilgrimage to Severn and the intensified religious activities within Strasbourg, the number of new cases began to decline, and many of the existing dancers started to recover or simply stop. You picture the scene at the shrine, people who had been twitching and swaying uncontrollably for days or weeks, suddenly finding moments of stillness, perhaps collapsing not from exhaustion of forced movement, but from the sheer relief of being able to choose to stop. The powerful psychological effect of being in a sacred space surrounded by others with the same affliction, participating in rituals specifically designed for this ailment, all under the strong suggestion of saintly intercession, it must have been immense. For minds and bodies pushed to the absolute brink, this dramatic change in environment and focus could have provided a psychological reset button, even if the underlying cause wasn't supernatural. The mainstream historical fact here is the documented decline in the dancing plague following the turn to religious intervention, particularly the pilgrimage to St. Vitus. While the precise cause is debated, the timing is noted in multiple historical records. The plague, which had peaked and seemed unstoppable, lost its terrifying momentum in the weeks following these efforts. The city council, which had tried secular solutions with such disastrous results, now saw the phenomenon receding after the spiritual approach. It's a potent reminder of the power of belief and ritual in a pre-scientific age, even if we might interpret the mechanisms differently today. Imagine the return journeys from Severn. Not all carts would have been quiet. Some people, sadly likely, did not recover, continuing their involuntary movements until collapse or death. The saint's intercession, if it was, that wasn't a magic wand for everyone. But for those who did find relief, the journey back must have been surreal. The absence of constant frantic movement would have felt alien, perhaps even unsettling at first, like a limb that's been asleep finally waking up. But instead of pins and needles, it's the terrifying memory of having no control. Back in Strasbourg, the atmosphere would have slowly shifted. The frantic energy of the dancing streets began to subside, replaced by a wary quiet. The stages that had been erected for the dancers now stood empty, grim monuments to a failed experiment. The constant, unnerving sound of shuffling feet and ragged breathing faded, leaving an eerie silence. Remember the constant, bewildering noise. Now you're listening to the birds again, or the ordinary sounds of a city. Carts rumbling, voices talking, blacksmiths hammering. But those ordinary sounds would have been underscored by the silence where the dancing used to be. The question of why it stopped became the new mystery. Was it St. Vitus, as the church and many citizens would have believed? Had their collective prayers and acts of penance appeased a wrathful God? Or was it something else? This is where the open scholarly debate phrase comes in again. Historians still argue whether the cessation of the dancing was directly caused by the religious interventions, or if it was the natural exhaustion of the afflicted, the psychological release offered by the pilgrimage, or perhaps other unknown factors contributing to the phenomenon's decline. Pinpointing the exact cause and effect in such a complex historical event, particularly one involving potential mass psychogenic illness, is incredibly challenging. The period immediately after the plague subsided wasn't one of carefree celebration. It was likely marked by exhaustion, grief for those lost, and a lingering unease. What if it came back? The city council, perhaps breathing a sigh of relief, tempered with caution, would have needed to address the aftermath. There would have been funerals to arrange families to support, and an underlying trauma that affected the entire community. The psychological scars don't disappear just because the physical manifestation does. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the aftermath involves what the city did to prevent a recurrence. Alongside continued religious observances and processions, there were regulations put in place concerning musical instruments and dancing. The previous ban on public dancing and music wasn't just lifted when the plague stopped. It was often reinforced, at least for a time. They didn't want to take any chances. It's strange to think that after a plague of involuntary dancing, the response wasn't to celebrate with dancing, but to be even more restrictive about it. You imagine nervous officials eyeing anyone who tapped their foot a little too vigorously, whispering about the potential return of the dancing sickness. It's almost comical, but also speaks to the deep fear the event instilled. There are accounts suggesting that the church continued to play a role in the lives of those who had been afflicted even after they stopped dancing. Special services might have been held or ongoing care provided for those weakened by their ordeal. The focus remained largely spiritual, seeing the cessation of the dancing as a sign of divine mercy or saintly healing. This reinforced the religious interpretation of the event within the community's memory. The silence that fell over Strasbourg must have been deafening after weeks of the constant, horrifying rhythm of the dance. You could finally hear the river Ill flowing the distant church bells, the normal sounds of life. But those sounds would have carried the echoes of what had happened. Every quiet corner, every empty square, every street would have held memories of the tormented bodies that had moved through them. The aftermath wasn't just about the physical stopping of the movement. It was about the psychological recovery. Imagine the conversations. Do you remember when old Thomas couldn't stop? He just stood there for 3 days, swaying by the market fountain. Poor Agnes, she danced until her feet bled. People trying to process what they had seen, what they had endured. The shared trauma would have bound the community together, but also left lasting emotional wounds. The authorities, while relieved, were still left with the problem of explaining it all. The official narrative would likely have leaned heavily on the religious explanation. St. Vitus had answered their prayers. This provided a framework for understanding that fit within their worldview. It was easier to believe a saint had intervened than to grapple with the terrifying idea of a sickness that made people dance themselves to death, seemingly without reason. The end of the dancing didn't mean an immediate return to normal. The city's economy had been disrupted. Families had suffered losses and fear lingered. Special masses and processions likely continued for some time, giving thanks for the deliverance and praying for continued protection. The image of St. Vitus would have gained even greater prominence, his statue or image perhaps adorned with tokens of gratitude from those who believed they had been cured. Some accounts from the time suggest that while the main outbreak in Strasbourg subsided, scattered incidents might have continued in surrounding areas for a bit longer, or perhaps flared up in other towns. This wasn't necessarily a singular event confined strictly to the city limits, but Strasbourg was certainly the most notable and dramatic instance. This hints that whatever the cause, it wasn't purely confined to Strasbourg's specific circumstances, though the city provided the fertile ground for the largest and most tragic manifestation. The silence after the storm, as it were, allowed for reflection, but also for the lingering mystery to settle in. They had lived through something extraordinary and terrifying, something that defied easy explanation. The records show the steps they took, the ban on music, the stages, the pilgrimage. but they don't fully capture the terror, the desperation, or the bewildering nature of the experience. The city council would have gone back to dealing with more mundane affairs, trade regulations, taxes, local disputes. But they would have done so as men who had faced down a dancing plague. You can almost see them sitting in their council chambers, perhaps a little jumpy, glancing out the windows, half expecting to see a lone figure start twitching in the square below. The end of the active dancing plague in Strasbourg was not a clear victory over a known enemy, but more like the mysterious departure of an unwelcome, terrifying guest. It left behind questions that historians are still trying to answer centuries later. What truly happened in the summer of 1518? The most immediate question for the people of Strasbourg, however, was simply, is it really over? And they held their breath, listening to the silence, hoping it would last. So the immediate crisis had passed, the frantic movements had ceased, and the city of Strasbourg began the slow process of picking up the pieces. But the memory of that strange summer lingered, a dark stain on the city's history, a bewildering tale that defied easy explanation. How do you make sense of something so utterly bizarre, so devastating, yet so seemingly impossible? The people who lived through it, the chroniclers who recorded it, and the historians who studied it in the centuries since have all grappled with this fundamental question. In the immediate aftermath, the dominant framework for understanding such a phenomenon was, as you saw with the pilgrimage to St. Vitus, deeply rooted in religious belief. Events like this were often interpreted as divine punishment, the work of demons, or perhaps the strange manifestation of spiritual affliction. The chroniclers of the time, like those whose writings we touched upon, meticulously recorded the facts. The number of dancers, the duration, the attempts by the council, the turn to religious remedies. But their interpretations were filtered through a worldview where the supernatural was a very real, tangible force in daily life. One of the mainstream historical facts about the period immediately following the plague is how it was integrated into local folklore and religious narratives. The belief that St. Vitus had intervened to stop the dancing became a reinforced part of Strasbourg's identity. Votive offerings, special prayers, and annual processions related to the saint and deliverance from the dancing sickness may have continued for some time, solidifying the idea of a miraculous cure. It wasn't just history, it became part of the city's spiritual fabric, a cautionary tale and a testament to faith. Over the following centuries, as medical understanding slowly evolved, other explanations began to surface, though they were often still intertwined with older beliefs. The idea that it might be a natural illness gained traction, but what kind of illness could make you dance against your will? Early physicians and scholars speculated on various physiological causes, perhaps imbalances in the body's humors, or some kind of fever that affected the brain. Without germ theory or modern psychology, these early medical theories often seem quaint, almost comical to us now. Imagine a doctor scratching their head looking at a patient who just can't stop jigging and concluding, "Ah, yes, clearly an excess of melancholy black bile causing the limbs to involuntarily perform spirited folk dances. A good bleed and some soothing poultices should do the trick. Maybe hold the lute music just in case." As time marched on, the story of the dancing plague became more of a historical curiosity, a strange footnote in the annals of medieval European history. It was often retold in chronicles and later history books, but sometimes simplified or embellished. Like a game of historical telephone, the details might shift slightly with each retelling, the sheer strangeness of the event, perhaps amplified or downplayed, depending on the writer's perspective or agenda. A quirky or fringe tidbit that emerged in later interpretations sometimes linked the dancing plague to other similar outbreaks that had occurred in Europe centuries earlier. There were scattered reports of similar manias, sometimes involving dancing, sometimes other strange collective behaviors dating back even to the Middle Ages. Some historians or folklorists wondered if there was a continuity, a recurring pattern of mass hysteria, or a specific, perhaps environmental trigger that manifested periodically. Was the Strasbourg incident a unique event or just the most dramatic recent example of a recurring, baffling phenomenon? The idea that this wasn't the only time people had danced themselves to death, even if the details varied, adds another layer of historical mystery. It suggests a potential underlying vulnerability or trigger that was present in European society at different points. The 19th and 20th centuries brought a more scientific approach to historical investigation, and the dancing plague was revisited with new analytical tools. Two main competing scientific theories emerged, and this is where the open scholarly debate phrase remains highly relevant. Historians and scientists still vigorously debate whether the dancing plague of 1518 was primarily caused by ergot poisoning, or if it was a manifestation of mass psychogenic illness, MPI, also known as mass hysteria. Let's dive into those a little. The ergotism theory proposes that the people of Strasbourg were suffering from poisoning caused by consuming rye grain contaminated with ergot fungus. Claviceps purpurea. Ergot is a fungus that thrives in damp conditions and can grow on rye, a staple crop in medieval Europe. Ingesting ergot can cause a condition called ergotism, historically known as St. Anthony's fire, due to the burning sensation it can cause in the limbs. Ergotism can manifest in two main forms, convulsive and gangrenous. The convulsive form can cause painful spasms, tremors, hallucinations, and potentially involuntary movements. Advocates of the ergotism theory point to the symptoms described in historical accounts. The involuntary movements, the apparent lack of control, the pain and exhaustion, as potentially consistent with convulsive ergotism. They might also note that 1518 was reportedly a wet year, which could have favored fungal growth on crops. The fact that the poor who relied heavily on rye bread seemed particularly affected could also fit this theory. It offers a tangible biological explanation for a seemingly inexplicable phenomenon. However, the ergotism theory has its challenges, which is why the debate persists. Critics argue that while ergotism can cause spasms and hallucinations, the historical descriptions of the Strasbourg dancers focus more on organized, continuous dancing and shuffling, not necessarily the chaotic convulsions typically associated with ergot poisoning. Furthermore, ergotism usually comes with other severe symptoms like gangrene vomiting or severe hallucinations that aren't prominently mentioned in most accounts of the 1518 plague. If it was ergot, it would have had to be a very unusual manifestation of the poisoning. Plus, for so many people to be afflicted simultaneously and continuously for days or weeks, solely due to ergotism, seems unlikely to some researchers, especially given the scale and duration of the dancing. This leads us to the second major theory, mass psychogenic illness, MPI, or mass hysteria. This theory suggests that the dancing plague was a form of collective delusion or stress-induced behavior, triggered by extreme social and psychological pressures. Remember the terrible conditions we talked about: the famine, the disease, the social unrest, the pervasive fear of divine judgment. These were incredibly stressful times. The MPI theory posits that in such a heightened state of anxiety and desperation, coupled with potentially existing superstitions or beliefs about dancing manias, perhaps influenced by those earlier historical accounts, we just mentioned the stress manifested physically in this bizarre, contagious form of dancing. Proponents of the MPI theory argue that it better explains the dancing aspect, the continuous rhythmic, albeit involuntary movement, and the apparent psychological nature of the contagion. Stress and suggestibility are known to be powerful forces that can manifest in physical symptoms in groups of people even today. Think of strange outbreaks in schools where symptoms spread rapidly but have no clear physical cause. The fact that the phenomenon seemed to subside after the change in environment and the powerful religious interventions could also be seen as supporting evidence for a psychological rather than purely biological cause, as MPI can often be stopped or altered by changing the social context or beliefs. But the MPI theory also faces questions. Could psychological factors alone drive people to dance continuously for days or weeks, even to their death from exhaustion? While stress is powerful, the sheer physical toll and the seemingly uncontrollable nature described in accounts leads some to believe there must have been some underlying physical trigger or vulnerability, even if psychological factors amplified it. Perhaps it was a combination of factors, maybe a mild exposure to something like ergot that lowered people's physical and psychological resilience, making them more susceptible to a mass psychological suggestion or release mechanism triggered by the immense stress of their lives. So the debate continues. Historians and scientists pore over the limited primary sources, looking for clues, trying to reconcile the strange accounts with modern medical knowledge. Was it the fungus in the bread, the demons in their minds, or the stress in their souls? The evidence isn't clear-cut enough to definitively rule out one theory entirely or prove another beyond doubt. It's a fascinating example of how difficult it can be to diagnose a historical illness centuries after the fact with incomplete information, and from a vastly different cultural and scientific perspective. The Dancing Plague of 1518, therefore, isn't just a weird story about people dancing themselves to death. It's a case study in historical interpretation, the evolution of scientific thought, and the enduring mystery of mass behavior, especially when driven by extreme hardship and fear. It forces us to consider the complex interplay between biological factors, psychological states, social conditions, and cultural beliefs in shaping human experience, particularly in times of crisis. And what became of Strasbourg? The city, of course, survived. Life went on. The houses remained, the river still flowed, the cathedral stood tall. But the experience left an indelible mark. For generations, the tale of the dancers would have been whispered, a reminder of the summer the city lost its mind, or its body, or both. It was a cautionary tale about the thin line between order and chaos, between conscious control and something ancient and terrifying that could seize hold of you against your will. The historical records are sober matter-of-fact in places detailing council decrees and expenditures. But buried within them are hints of the human cost, the sheer terror and suffering. You can imagine the families of those who died left to grieve not just a death, but a death preceded by weeks of horrifying involuntary performance. The survivors, too, would have carried the trauma, the memory of watching friends and neighbors lose control in such a public, disturbing way. The Dancing Plague remains one of history's great enigmas. It's the kind of event that makes you pause and wonder about the limits of human endurance, the power of belief, and the strange ways that desperation and stress can manifest. We look back now with our understanding of psychology and disease and try to fit it into our frameworks, but it still resists a perfectly neat explanation. Perhaps that's part of its enduring fascination. It's a window into a world that was both deeply human in its suffering and fear, yet utterly alien in how that suffering was expressed and understood. A world where a city could literally dance itself into history books, forever marked by a summer of involuntary, fatal steps. So the dancing stopped. The exhaustion, the council's interventions, the symbolic pilgrimage, something or perhaps a complex interplay of things broke the spell. Strasbourg was left to count its dead men, its physical exhaustion, and grapple with the mental and emotional scars of that summer. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief mixed with lingering dread, like the quiet that follows a terrifying thunderstorm, where the air is still heavy with the possibility of another strike. The immediate challenge was recovery, burying the deceased, caring for the survivors, and attempting to return to some semblance of normal life amidst the ruins of their collective sanity. But in the background, a different kind of process was beginning. The slow, often uneven process of trying to understand what the actual heck just happened. For centuries, as we touched on, the primary framework for understanding events like this was frankly limited by the medical and scientific knowledge of the time. If you lived in the 16th century and people started dancing uncontrollably until they dropped dead, your go-to explanations wouldn't involve neurotransmitters or fungal toxins in rye bread. They'd involve divine displeasure, demonic possession, or perhaps some utterly bizarre alignment of the stars messing with people's humors. Remember those humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Medieval medicine believed imbalances in these fluids governed everything from your mood to whether you spontaneously started river dancing. So a physician might genuinely theorize that an excess of melancholy black bile had heated up the brain in a peculiar way, causing the limbs to twitch and leap uncontrollably. It sounds utterly ridiculous to us now, but that was cutting-edge medical thought compared to blaming it all on a grumpy demon who just really liked folk music. One of the mainstream historical facts related to the study of the Dancing Plague, often highlighted by later historians, is its inclusion in compilations of unusual medical cases and historical oddities. While it didn't immediately trigger a revolution in medical science or lead to the establishment of dedicated research centers for unexplained dancing outbreaks, the event was significant enough and strange enough to be recorded and passed down. Chroniclers like John Twyfell and the anonymous authors of various city records meticulously documented the events. Later scholars, compiling histories or catalogs of human afflictions, would include the Strasbourg dancing plague as a notable, albeit perplexing phenomenon. It became a data point, albeit a very weird one, in the historical record of human behavior and illness. These records, though sparse by modern standards, became the primary source material for anyone trying to make sense of it later. Imagine being a historian centuries later, poring over faded manuscripts, reading matter-of-fact accounts of people jigging themselves to death, and just thinking, okay, this is different. How do I even file this? The immediate impact on medicine in terms of advancing anatomical or physiological understanding was probably minimal. Physicians would continue to practice their humoral theories, bleeding patients prescribing poultices, and praying for the best. But the existence of such a widely documented, inexplicable event did contribute to a growing collection of cases that defied simple explanation, hinting at the complexity of the human body and mind in ways that humoral theory couldn't fully capture. It sat alongside other baffling conditions and collective behaviors reported throughout history, like other smaller dancing manias or strange fits and trances reported in convents or villages. As the centuries passed and medical science slowly, painstakingly advanced, the Strasbourg dancing plague remained a curious anomaly. It was mentioned in books on medical history, folklore, and social psychology. With the rise of germ theory in the 19th century, the idea of a biological cause became more plausible. This is when the ergotism theory really gained traction. The identification of ergot fungus and its toxic effects provided a potential physical mechanism for the dancing. Scientists could point to known symptoms of ergot poisoning, convulsions, hallucinations, pain, and see possible parallels with the historical accounts. It offered a neat, albeit incomplete explanation, rooted in biology fitting the dominant scientific paradigm of the time. It's like finally finding a potentially identifiable suspect for a historical crime that had been baffling detectives for ages. Aha! The Why Did It case closed. Maybe simultaneously, the emergence of psychology and sociology provided new lenses through which to view the event. Pioneers in these fields began to study collective behavior, social contagion, and the power of suggestion and stress. The concept of mass hysteria, or mass psychogenic illness, offered an alternative explanation, one that didn't rely on physical poison, but on the potent, often unpredictable dynamics of group psychology in the face of extreme adversity. The dancing plague, with its seemingly contagious nature and its occurrence during a period of immense social stress, became a textbook historical example, cited in early works on crowd psychology and abnormal behavior. You could imagine early psychologists excitedly pointing to Strasbourg on a map saying, "See, this proves it. The mind, when pushed to its absolute limit, en masse can do incredibly weird, physically demanding stuff." A quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes comes up in later discussions is the possibility explored by some folklorists and cultural historians that these dancing manias weren't just illness or hysteria, but perhaps a distorted or extreme manifestation of pre-existing folk practices or beliefs related to ecstatic dance, communal rituals, or even forms of protest or release valves for societal pressure. While this is a more speculative angle, it considers whether there was any cultural foundation that might have shaped how this affliction manifested. Was there a buried cultural memory of ecstatic dance or trance states that provided a template, however twisted, for the physical expression of this extreme stress? It's a fringe idea, certainly not mainstream, but it highlights how multifaceted the event appears when viewed through different academic lenses. It makes you wonder if there's a tiny, almost imperceptible link between a peaceful village dance and this horrifying involuntary jig. Probably not, but it's a thought. The dancing plague became a prominent case study in the ongoing open scholarly debate about the nature of historical outbreaks of unusual collective behavior. Historians, psychologists, medical researchers, and even folklorists continue to debate whether the event was primarily organic ergotism, primarily psychological mass hysteria, or a complex interaction between the two. This debate isn't just academic. It touches on fundamental questions about human vulnerability to environmental toxins, the power of the mind and social dynamics and how these factors interact, especially in times of crisis. The Strasbourg case is so compelling because it's well documented enough to invite detailed analysis, yet ambiguous enough to prevent any single theory from achieving universal acceptance. It serves as a stark reminder that our understanding of illness and behavior is constantly evolving. What was once seen as demonic possession became humoral imbalance, then potential poisoning, and finally a complex interplay of psychology and social stress. Each era has attempted to fit this strange event into its dominant scientific or cultural framework, and each attempt has revealed something but also left questions unanswered. The 15 and 18 outbreak stands as a sort of historical mirror reflecting the limitations of our knowledge at any given point in time. Modern medicine, with its vastly improved understanding of neurochemistry, infectious diseases, and psychosomatic conditions, still finds the Strasbourg case challenging. While mass psychogenic illness is a recognized phenomenon and ergotism is a known condition, neither perfectly explains the specific details: the duration, the mortality rate, the precise nature of the movements, as described in the historical records. This lack of a perfect fit is precisely why it remains such a valuable case study. It pushes researchers to consider the gray areas, the possibilities of rare or synergistic effects, and the difficulty of retrospective diagnosis across centuries of vastly different human experience and environmental factors. The event, while not triggering an immediate revolution in medical understanding in 1518, certainly contributed to the body of historical evidence that fuels ongoing inquiry into the intersection of mind, body, and society. It's a classic example used in discussions about the history of medicine, the history of psychology, and the study of social phenomena. It highlights how seemingly bizarre events can arise from a potent mix of environmental factors, social stress, and psychological vulnerability. Think about it: this single terrifying summer provided data points that would be pondered by physicians, philosophers, social scientists, and historians for half a millennium. It became a touchstone for anyone trying to understand the darkest, most inexplicable corners of human behavior and suffering. It's a historical enigma wrapped in a medical puzzle tied with a ribbon of sheer human desperation. And its continued study reminds us that even with all our modern knowledge, history can still present mysteries that humble us. So while Strasbourg didn't build a research institute dedicated to dancing plagues in 1519, the event itself became a catalyst for later inquiry, a bizarre entry in the catalog of human suffering that demanded explanation, even if that explanation wouldn't arrive, or rather wouldn't be fully debated for centuries to come. It forced later thinkers to stretch their concepts of what illness could be, what could make a body move against its will, and how deeply intertwined physical and psychological states truly are, especially when amplified by collective fear and hardship. And as you drift deeper into this story, remember how layers of interpretation build up over time. The simple, terrifying fact of people dancing themselves to death becomes, over centuries, a case study in toxicology, psychology, sociology, and historical method. It's a reminder that history isn't just a list of facts. It's a continuous process of trying to make sense of the past, often grappling with events that resist easy answers, like a city that couldn't stop moving. The situation doesn't just worsen after that initial week, it explodes. From a few dozen, the number of dancers seems to double, then triple, then climb into the hundreds with terrifying speed. It's no longer confined to a designated square or two. The streets themselves are starting to fill with these relentless, moving figures. You walk down a familiar alleyway expecting to see vendors or neighbors, but instead you see people shuffling, swaying, turning, lost in their own private hell of perpetual motion. It's like the city itself is starting to writhe. The initial shock gives way to profound, paralyzing fear. The whispers turn into shouts, the worried faces into masks of terror. People start to barricade themselves in their homes, peering out through cracks in the shutters at the bizarre, horrifying spectacle unfolding outside. The sounds of daily life, the blacksmith's hammer, the market chatter, the church bells, are increasingly drowned out by the sounds of the dancing plague, the rhythmic scuffing of hundreds of feet on cobblestones, the gasping breaths, the occasional cry of pain or exhaustion, maybe even the distant eerie pipes of the musicians the council still had, playing in some areas, a ghastly soundtrack to the unfolding nightmare. Seriously imagine that being your commute, dodging people trapped in an involuntary disco. This isn't just a few eccentrics now. These are your neighbors. The baker who sold you bread, the weaver who made your cloth, the woman who lived down the street with her children. Men and women, young and old, from different social classes. The sheer scale of it is overwhelming. Historians still debate whether the social structure of Strasbourg played a specific role in the spread, considering the city's unique political and economic situation at the time. But the fact remains that this affliction crossed all boundaries of wealth and status. The city council, the same officials who thought stages and music were the answer, are now in a full-blown panic. Their misguided attempt to control the situation by giving it space and rhythm didn't contain it. It amplified it. They tried medicine. The physicians of the time, steeped in Galenic theory, would have offered bleedings, purges, or herbal concoctions, none of which, unsurprisingly, had any effect on people whose only symptom was involuntary nonstop dancing. Quirkier, still some medieval medical texts suggested specific amulets or charms to ward off dancing manias, often involving writing certain words or symbols on parchment and wearing them. You might see people desperately clutching these useless talismans, hoping they'd provide protection from this inexplicable curse. When medicine failed and their own remedies backfired, the authorities turned, as was common in the Middle Ages, to the divine. This was clearly not a physical ailment in their eyes anymore. It had to be spiritual. Was it a punishment from God, or perhaps worse, the work of the devil exorcists were called in? Religious processions were organized, intended to appeal for divine intervention or ward off evil spirits. Imagine trying to perform a solemn religious rite while hundreds of people are compulsively jigging in the background. It must have been a scene of utter chaos and desperation. The mainstream historical fact here is grim and unavoidable. As the number of dancers grew into the hundreds, the death toll began to mount significantly. People were not just dancing until they were exhausted. They were dancing until their bodies gave out completely. Accounts speak of dancers collapsing from heart attacks, strokes, sheer dehydration, or critical exhaustion. Their muscles would give out, their organs would fail, and they would simply drop dead in the streets or in the designated dancing areas. This wasn't a performance. It was a fatal illness measured in relentless movement. You see the carts starting to appear, grimly collecting the bodies of those who had danced their last. It's a stark, horrifying reminder of the reality of the situation. The initial fear has curdled into a deeper, more profound dread. Who will be next? When will this end? The city is effectively under siege, not by an army, but by an invisible, incomprehensible force that compels its citizens to dance to their deaths. The authorities, facing a crisis they cannot comprehend and cannot stop, are floundering. Their religious interventions seem as ineffective as their medical and civic ones. The populace is terrified and looking to them for answers and solutions they simply don't have. There would have been intense debate within the council chambers, some arguing for harsher measures, perhaps trying to physically restrain the dancers. Though imagine the logistical nightmare and the sheer number of people needed to forcibly hold down hundreds of individuals driven by an unstoppable compulsion. Others likely pushed for more fervent prayer or different religious rites. One of the most desperate measures they eventually resorted to, born out of a mix of religious fear and a complete lack of other options, was to try and appease whatever they believed was causing the plague. This involved pilgrimage. The council decided to send the remaining dancers, or at least those who could still move on a pilgrimage, to the shrine of Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a saint whose intercession was often sought against dancing manias or twitching diseases, likely because of a legend associating him with curing epilepsy, which sometimes involves involuntary movements. The idea was that by bringing the afflicted to a holy place dedicated to a saint, known for treating such conditions, they might be healed. This wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a frantic, large-scale operation to get these relentlessly moving people out of the city and onto the road. You can almost picture the scene. Hundreds of exhausted, half-dead dancers, maybe supported or guided by weary city officials or healthy citizens, being steered towards the pilgrimage route, still shuffling and swaying as they went. It's a horrifying image, a testament to the utter desperation of the time. Historians still argue fiercely about the exact primary cause of the dancing plague. While the sheer death toll and scale are undeniable facts, the underlying trigger remains elusive. Was it ergotism, a condition caused by consuming rye contaminated with the ergot fungus? which can cause convulsions and hallucinations? Was it a form of mass psychogenic illness, a collective hysteria brought on by stress, superstition, and fear in a time of hardship? Or was it something else entirely? The sources from the time don't provide a clear medical or psychological explanation that satisfies modern understanding, leaving plenty of room for academic debate. The panic is palpable throughout the city. Businesses are likely shuttering, markets are emptying, people are afraid to go outside for fear of either catching the dancing sickness, whatever it was, or simply witnessing the horrific scenes unfolding. The air is thick with fear and desperation. You might see families desperately trying to care for afflicted relatives, struggling to feed or water them as they continue their involuntary dance. It's a humanitarian crisis layered on top of an incomprehensible medical mystery. The authorities' focus has shifted entirely from trying to treat the dancing with music to simply trying to make it stop, or at least get it out of their city. The pilgrimage to St. Vitus represents this shift from misguided therapy to desperate expulsion or appeal to higher powers. It's a Hail Mary pass in the face of utter catastrophe. The city that only weeks ago was a bustling center of commerce and life is now known for this terrifying, fatal dance, a place where the rhythm of life has been replaced by the unstoppable, deathly beat of hundreds of shuffling feet. And the worst is yet to come. So you're in Strasbourg. The city is a swirling, shuffling mass of involuntary dancers, and the authorities have thrown everything they have at it. Music, medicine, prayer, exorcism, and nothing has worked. Their last desperate gamble, as you remember, was to send the remaining dancers, who were still somehow on their feet, on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus near Saverne, a town roughly 20 miles away. St. Vitus, or St. Guy, as he's sometimes known, was the go-to saint for anything involving involuntary movements, likely because of his purported ability to cure epilepsy. If anyone could fix this bizarre, deathly jig, maybe it was him. Imagine the scene. It's less a pious procession and more a forced march of the damned. These aren't pilgrims singing hymns and contemplating scripture. These are people locked in relentless motion, their bodies aching, their minds likely foggy with exhaustion and delirium. City officials, perhaps wary priests and maybe hired hands or volunteers, would have been tasked with guiding these hundreds of shuffling figures out of the city gates and onto the road towards Saverne. You might see them trying to steer a group of dancers who are swaying dangerously close to a ditch, or perhaps dragging those who have finally collapsed from the road. It's a grim, surreal spectacle, this slow, stumbling river of humanity making its way out of Strasbourg still dancing. The destination, the Shrine of St. Vitus, was housed in a small chapel just outside Saverne. According to some accounts, special boots or shoes were prepared for the dancers upon their arrival, perhaps meant to be blessed or somehow imbued with the saint's power, adding another layer of peculiar ritual to the unfolding tragedy. You picture these worn-out, dirt-caked dancers being fitted with these special shoes, maybe hoping against hope that this simple act, this journey, this saint would break the terrible spell. It feels almost like a scene from a dark fairy tale, doesn't it? Except the monsters are your own neighbors and the curse is invisible and seemingly unbreakable. But did the pilgrimage work? Did St. Vitus intervene? Mainstream historical accounts based on contemporary chronicles suggest that while some dancers may have found temporary respite or eventual recovery, there was no mass instantaneous miracle. The dancing didn't just stop the moment they arrived at the shrine. Many continued to dance even there on the very grounds meant to heal them. It highlights the baffling nature of the affliction. It wasn't something a change of scenery or a saint's blessing could simply erase. It was deeply rooted, whatever its cause. This period, even as some dancers were being moved, likely represented the peak of the crisis back in Strasbourg and the surrounding areas. The numbers continued to climb into the hundreds. The death toll, as mentioned before, was significant. Chroniclers from the time recorded deaths from sheer exhaustion, cardiovascular failure, and dehydration. Imagine being a physician, then having absolutely no framework to understand this. Your entire medical education, based on humor's imbalance, is useless against a disease whose primary symptom is dancing. You'd be just as terrified and bewildered as everyone else. The city itself was becoming a ghost town in many ways. Fear was a more effective barrier than any wall. People stayed indoors, Supplies dwindled as markets were abandoned, and the constant, eerie sound of shuffling feet must have been a relentless psychological torture. You're holed up in your house trying to silence your own movements, terrified that an involuntary twitch might be the first sign that you've caught the fatal rhythm. Historians still debate whether the pilgrimage to St. Vitus had any effect beyond simply removing some afflicted individuals from the immediate urban environment of Strasbourg. Some argue it might have had a psychological impact on some dancers, the ritual and the journey providing a narrative that allowed their minds and bodies to eventually find release. Others maintain it was merely a desperate measure with little actual efficacy against the underlying cause, whatever that was. It's another layer of mystery. Did the belief in the cure, even if it wasn't a physical cure, play a role for some quirky detail from the historical records mentions specific rituals performed at the St. Vitus Shrine for those suffering from dancing manias or similar afflictions? These rituals sometimes involve placing the afflicted person in a particular spot, having specific prayers recited over them, or even using certain objects believed to have curative properties. You can imagine the scene at the shrine priests attempting these ancient solemn rites, perhaps sprinkling holy water or offering blessed bread, while the subjects of their ministrations are still uncontrollably shaking, spinning, or swaying. It's a collision of faith desperation and incomprehensible reality. A bit like trying to perform an opera while the entire chorus is spontaneously breakdancing. The high point of the crisis in terms of sheer numbers of afflicted and the resulting panic and death occurred around July and August of 1518. The city chronicles and other documents from the time paint a picture of a community overwhelmed and facing something entirely unprecedented. The loss of life wasn't just statistics. It was neighbor after neighbor succumbing to the relentless dance. So if the pilgrimage wasn't a magic bullet and the prayers weren't immediately answered, how did it end? This is where the historical accounts become less dramatic and more fade out. The dancing plague didn't vanish overnight in a single climactic event. It appears to have gradually subsided over several weeks, starting in late summer and early autumn of 1518. The number of new cases seems to have dwindled and the remaining dancers utterly exhausted, and perhaps having reached some physical or psychological limit, slowly stopped. There's no single universally accepted explanation for this gradual decline. It's another point where historians still fiercely argue whether environmental factors played a role, like a change in weather or the end of a particularly stressful period. Strasbourg had faced hardship before the plague. Or did the collective panic simply burn itself out? Did the pilgrimage, despite its lack of instant miracles, contribute by dispersing some dancers and providing a focus for those who remained? The truth is, we don't know exactly why it stopped, just that. It did, slowly leaving behind a city traumatized and bewildered. You imagine the quiet returning to the streets, the horrifying soundtrack of shuffling feet gradually fading. Families cautiously emerging from their homes, looking around at a city scarred by this strange, fatal madness. The relief must have been immense, but it would have been tempered by grief for those lost and a lingering unease. What was that? Could it happen again? As the autumn leaves began to turn, the dancing plague of 1518 became a grim memory, a story passed down in hushed tones. The immediate crisis was over. The unstoppable movement had finally ceased, not with a bang, but a slow, weary silence. The city could begin the long process of burying its dead and trying to make sense of the incomprehensible events of that summer. But the questions would remain echoing down the centuries, just like the phantom rhythm of those hundreds of dancing feet. So as we drifted off in the last section, you were imagining the slow return of quiet to the streets of Strasbourg, the relentless shuffling of feet, the bizarre, tragic soundtrack of that summer finally beginning to fade. It wasn't like flipping a switch. There was no specific day when the dancing stopped for everyone. Instead, it seems to have dwindled, a wave receding rather than crashing to a halt. Over several weeks in late summer and early autumn of 1518, the afflicted individuals, those who had survived the terrible ordeal, gradually ceased their involuntary movements. Perhaps sheer physical exhaustion simply took its inevitable toll, wearing down even the most persistent dancer until their body could no longer sustain the frantic energy. Or maybe for some, the change in environment during the pilgrimage, the ritual, the belief, or even just the simple passage of time allowed their minds and bodies to finally find a fragile peace. The city was left to grapple with the aftermath. The records from the time, incomplete and sometimes confusing as they are, hint at a community trying to piece itself back together. There were funerals, of course, many of them. The death toll, while uncertain in exact numbers, was significant enough to be remarked upon by multiple chroniclers. Imagine the collective grief, the trauma. Not only had these people lost loved ones, but those loved ones had died in the most bizarre and public way imaginable, their last days a spectacle of uncontrollable movement. How do you even begin to process that mainstream historical accounts confirm that authorities had to deal with the practical consequences too? There would have been sanitation issues managing the bodies of the deceased and trying to restore some semblance of order to a city that had been paralyzed by fear and this strange affliction. The city council, the church, the medical professionals of the day, they were all left trying to understand what had just happened and, crucially, whether it could happen again. There would have been investigations, discussions, attempts to find a rational explanation within their 16th century understanding of the world. Fast forward several centuries, and historians and scientists are still picking over the bones, metaphorical mostly, of the dancing plague of 1518. With the benefit of modern knowledge about diseases, psychology, and social phenomena, several theories have emerged to try and explain this utterly baffling event. One of the most persistent and widely discussed is the idea of ergot poisoning. You might have heard of ergot. It's a type of fungus, specifically Claviceps purpurea, that can grow on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. If you consume flour or bread made from contaminated grain, you can get a nasty condition called ergotism. There are two main forms: gangrenous ergotism, which is truly horrific and causes limbs to rot off, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, and convulsive ergotism. Now, convulsive ergotism causes a whole range of neurological symptoms. We're talking painful spasms, vomiting, hallucinations, delusions, and yes, sometimes involuntary muscle contractions and tremors that could potentially manifest as something resembling uncontrollable dancing or twitching. It's a compelling theory, isn't it? Strasbourg was in a region known for growing rye, and historical records mention poor harvests and potential food shortages leading up to 1518 conditions that might favor fungal growth and the consumption of contaminated grain. The symptoms of convulsive ergotism, the spasms, the potential for delirium, seem to fit, at least superficially, with the description of people dancing uncontrollably. You can imagine someone consuming contaminated bread, starting to twitch and spasm, perhaps experiencing terrifying hallucinations, and in their confused state, their movements being interpreted by themselves and others as a compulsion to dance. It's a neat package, a biological explanation for a seemingly supernatural event. However, as with many historical mysteries, it's not quite that simple. While ergotism can cause spasms, historians still argue whether the symptoms of ergot poisoning fully explain the specific nature and duration of the Strasbourg dancing plague. Critics of the ergot theory point out that while convulsive ergotism causes twitching and painful spasms, it doesn't typically cause rhythmic, sustained movements that look like dancing, sometimes lasting for days or weeks. Also, other common symptoms of ergotism, like gangrene, nausea, and vomiting, aren't prominently mentioned in the historical accounts of the dancers. You'd think if hundreds of people were suffering from ergotism, there would be widespread reports of these other nasty symptoms alongside the dancing. It's a bit like saying someone must have the flu because they sneezed once, ignoring the fact that they also have a broken leg and are reciting poetry backwards. So if not ergot, what else? The other major theory that has gained traction, particularly in recent decades, is that the dancing plague was a classic case of mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. You might know this by its older, perhaps less accurate name, mass hysteria. This theory suggests that the dancing wasn't caused by a physical toxin or disease, but by extreme psychological stress, fear, and shared belief manifesting in physical symptoms. Think about the conditions in Strasbourg leading up to the summer of 1518. We've touched on them. Famine, disease, hardship, general unease, maybe a harsh winter. This wasn't a city having a picnic. People were living under significant stress. Add to this the existing cultural beliefs about dancing manias. The idea that such a thing could happen, perhaps as a curse or a divine punishment. Remember those earlier outbreaks in other parts of Europe? The concept wasn't entirely foreign, even if this scale was unprecedented. The MPI theory proposes that in a highly stressed and suggestible population, under the right circumstances, psychological distress can trigger real physical symptoms. One person starts exhibiting unusual behavior, maybe initially triggered by something physical or maybe just extreme anxiety. And because of the prevailing beliefs and fear, others interpret it as the dancing plague, and through social contagion, begin to exhibit similar symptoms themselves. It's like a terrible involuntary flash mob of existential dread. This theory aligns well with several aspects of the event. MPI outbreaks often occur in groups under stress. The symptoms can be dramatic and unusual. They can spread rapidly through a population connected by proximity and communication, or lack thereof, leading to fearful rumors. And importantly, MPI symptoms can be influenced by cultural expectations. In this case, the expectation of a dancing compulsion. The lack of other clear physical symptoms mentioned in the chronicles also fits the MPI model better than ergotism for some researchers. A quirky detail sometimes brought up in discussions of MPI is the power of expectation. If you genuinely believe you are cursed to dance, or that St. Vitus is making you move, that belief can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, driving your actions even if there isn't a physical toxin forcing you to move. It's a fascinating, slightly terrifying glimpse into the power of the human mind and the way it interacts with the body and the social environment. Historians still debate whether ergotism or mass psychogenic illness was the primary driver, or if perhaps it was a complex interplay of both. A small initial trigger, maybe even some mild food poisoning, amplified by the immense psychological and social pressures of the time. Some researchers even propose other fringe theories like peculiar neurological conditions, or even more esoteric explanations that haven't gained mainstream acceptance. What is clear is that the dancing plague of 1518 left an indelible mark on Strasbourg's history. It was a real event documented by multiple sources, resulting in real suffering and death. It stands as one of the most dramatic examples of collective behavior gone terribly wrong, a historical puzzle that continues to fascinate and baffle us centuries later. The story of the town that danced itself to death serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of human society, the strange things stress and fear can do to us, and the persistent mysteries that lie buried in the past. It also highlights how our understanding of something like illness has changed so dramatically, from humors and curses to fungi and psychology. As the years passed, the memory of the dancing summer faded, becoming a strange cautionary tale. The fields were replanted, the markets reopened, and life as it always does slowly returned to normal in Strasbourg. But somewhere in the quiet archives, in the dry historical texts, and now in the hushed tones of a podcast, the echoes of those hundreds of shuffling feet still linger, a haunting rhythm from a time when the inexplicable took center stage, forcing an entire community into a dance of death. And with the mystery laid bare, the theories discussed, and the echoes fading, our journey through the summer of 1518 comes to a close. The strange, terrible energy of the dance has finally dissipated, leaving only silence. Okay, you've been on quite the journey tonight, haven't you? All the way back to a very strange summer in Strasbourg. Hundreds of people lost in a compelled dance, a mystery that still whispers down the ages. But the energy of that time, that frantic, unstoppable movement, it's all in the past now. It's done. The music has stopped. The silence has returned. You can feel yourself settling down. Feel your own body relaxing, becoming still. There's no need to move, no need to worry about any phantom rhythms trying to pull you to your feet. That part of the story is over. You are safe, quiet, still. Let the sounds of the past fade away like the last notes of a forgotten, unsettling song. Your mind can release those images now. The shuffling feet, the strained faces, the worried authorities. Just let them go. They belong to a different time, a different place. Here now, there is only quiet, only peace. Feel the weight of your body heavy and comfortable. Feel your breathing slow and deep in a gentle, calming rhythm. Nothing to do now but rest. The mystery will keep, the historical debates will continue another day. For now, there is only the soft darkness, the quiet air, the feeling of drifting down into stillness. Just let go.